A millionaire decides to make a surprise visit to his daughter's home, who has been strangely absent for months. Upon entering, he finds her kneeling on the floor, silently scrubbing the floor, while tears stream down her face. The millionaire is completely shocked to discover what has been happening in that house, and what he decides to do next is truly heartwarming. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Oakwood Heights, an upscale neighborhood in the heart of Connecticut. Richard Hartley, a self-made millionaire with salt-and-pepper hair and piercing blue eyes, sat behind the wheel of his sleek black Mercedes, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. He hadn't seen his daughter Emily in nearly 6 months, and the gnawing worry in his gut had finally driven him to make this impromptu visit. As he pulled up to the impressive 2-story colonial house that he had helped finance for Emily and her husband, James, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The meticulously maintained exterior, with its pristine white paint and perfectly trimmed hedges, seemed almost too perfect, like a facade hiding something beneath. Richard stepped out of his car, straightening his tailored suit as he approached the front door. He raised his hand to knock, but paused when he noticed the door was slightly ajar. A chill ran down his spine as he heard muffled sobs coming from inside. "Emily!" he called out, pushing the door open gently. The foyer was immaculate, not a speck of dust in sight. The sob grew louder, seeming to come from upstairs. Richard's heart raced as he took the stairs 2 at a time, following the sound to the master bathroom. What he saw there made his blood run cold. Emily, his vibrant, intelligent daughter, was on her knees, scrubbing furiously at the tile floor. Her once lustrous brown hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her slender frame seemed even thinner than he remembered. "Emily, sweetheart, what's going on?" Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily's head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise, and was that fear? "Dad, I didn't hear you come in," she stammered, quickly wiping her tears away with the back of her hand. She scrambled to her feet, smoothing down her clothes. "I was just cleaning. You know how James likes everything to be perfect." Richard's brow furrowed as he took in the scene before him. The bathroom was already spotless, yet Emily had been scrubbing as if her life depended on it. "Honey, the place looks immaculate. Why were you crying?" Emily's lower lip trembled as she struggled to maintain her composure. "It's nothing, Dad. Really. I want everything to be perfect for James when he gets home." Richard stepped closer, gently placing his hands on Emily's shoulders. He could feel her trembling beneath his touch. "Emily, look at me," he said softly but firmly. When she finally met his gaze, he saw the pain and exhaustion in her eyes. "This isn't like you. What's really going on?" For a moment, it seemed as though Emily might break down and tell him everything. But then, like a switch had been flipped, she plastered on a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm just tired, Dad. It's been a long day and I have so much to do before James gets home. Why don't we go downstairs and have some tea? I can tell you all about the charity gala I'm helping to organize." As Emily brushed past him, heading for the stairs, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that he was looking at a stranger wearing his daughter's face. The Emily he knew was confident, ambitious, and full of life. This woman before him seemed like a shell of her former self, going through the motions of a life that no longer fit her. Following her down to the kitchen, Richard watched as Emily moved with practiced efficiency, putting the kettle on and retrieving delicate china cups from a high shelf. Her movements were almost robotic, as if she had performed this routine countless times before. "So tell me about this gala," Richard prompted, hoping to get Emily to open up. As she launched into a detailed explanation of seating arrangements and floral centerpieces, Richard noticed how her eyes kept darting to the clock on the wall. Every few minutes, she would glance at it, a flicker of anxiety crossing her face. "Emily," Richard interrupted gently, "when is James due home?" The question seemed to startle her, and she nearly dropped the cup she was holding. "Oh, around 6 usually, but sometimes he works late, so I always make sure dinner is ready and waiting, just in case." Richard glanced at his watch. It was barely 4:30 p.m. "And you're already this worried about having everything perfect for him." Emily's hands trembled slightly as she set the cups down on the kitchen island. "James works so hard, Dad. He deserves to come home to a clean house and a hot meal. It's the least I can do." The words sent a chill down Richard's spine. This wasn't the independent, career-driven daughter he had raised. Something had changed, and he was determined to find out what. "What about your work?" Richard asked, trying to keep his tone casual. "Last time we spoke, you were excited about that marketing project you were leading. How did that turn out?" Emily's eyes widened for a moment before she quickly looked away. "Oh, that. Well, you know how it is in the corporate world. The project got reassigned. James thought it would be better if I focused on supporting his career for now. He says it's important for me to be available for networking events and client dinners." Richard felt a surge of anger rising within him. He remembered how passionate Emily had been about her career, how she had worked tirelessly to climb the corporate ladder. The idea that she had given it all up to be a glorified hostess for her husband's business dealings was inconceivable. "Emily," Richard said, his voice low and serious, "I want you to be honest with me. Are you happy?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Emily opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway cut through the tension like a knife. Emily's face drained of color. "James is home early," she whispered, panic evident in her voice. She rushed to the oven, pulling out a casserole that Richard hadn't even realized was cooking. "Dad, please don't say anything to upset him." "Everything's fine, really. I'm happy. We're happy." As the front door opened and James's footsteps echoed through the house, Richard watched his daughter transform before his eyes. Her spine straightened, a practiced smile spread across her face, and she moved to greet her husband as if she were an actress stepping onto a stage. Richard stood in the kitchen, his tea forgotten as he listened to the overly cheerful exchange in the foyer. He knew one thing for certain: he wasn't leaving this house until he uncovered the truth about what was happening to his beloved daughter. The perfect facade of Emily and James's life was cracking, and Richard was determined to break it wide open, no matter the cost. As James's voice grew louder, approaching the kitchen, Richard steeled himself for the confrontation to come. He may not have all the answers yet, but he was certain of one thing: the battle for his daughter's future was about to begin. James Forrester strode into the kitchen, his polished leather shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. At 35, he cut an impressive figure in his tailored suit, his dark hair perfectly coiffed and his smile dazzling. But as Richard observed his son-in-law, he noticed something cold in those charming green eyes. "Richard! What a pleasant surprise!" James exclaimed, extending his hand. His grip was firm, almost challenging. "To what do we owe the pleasure?" Richard matched James's grip, holding it a moment longer than necessary. "Just thought I'd drop by and see how my daughter is doing. It's been too long since we've had a chance to catch up." James's smile didn't waver, but something flickered in his eyes. Annoyance, perhaps? Of course, family is so important. "Emily, darling, why didn't you tell me your father was coming?" Emily, who had been quietly arranging the table settings, looked up with a start. Dad's visit was unexpected. I was just about to call you when you arrived home early." James moved to Emily's side, wrapping an arm around her waist, in a gesture that seemed more possessive than affectionate. "Well, isn't this wonderful? We can all have dinner together. Emily, sweetheart, why don't you open a bottle of that Bordeaux we've been saving? I'm sure your father would appreciate it." As Emily hurried to comply, Richard couldn't help but notice how she seemed to shrink under James's touch, how her movements were almost robotic as she retrieved the wine and glasses. It was a far cry from the confident, vivacious woman she had once been. "So, James," Richard began, taking a seat at the kitchen island, "how's business? Emily mentioned you've been working late quite often." James's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Business is booming, Richard. In fact, we just landed a major client last week. I couldn't have done it without Emily's support, of course. She's been invaluable in helping me network and entertain clients." Richard nodded slowly, watching as Emily poured the wine with trembling hands. "I see. And Emily, how are you finding all this networking? Last time we spoke, you were leading your own marketing projects. Do you miss that?" A tense silence fell over the kitchen. Emily froze, the wine bottle hovering over the third glass. James's arm tightened almost imperceptibly around her waist. "Oh, well," Emily stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. I enjoy supporting James. His work is so important and—" "Emily has found her true calling in being a supportive wife," James interrupted smoothly. We've discussed it at length, and we both agree that focusing on my career is the best move for our future. Isn't that right, darling? Emily nodded quickly, avoiding her father's gaze. Yes, of course. It's what's best for us. Richard felt a surge of anger rising within him. The Emily he knew would never have given up her own ambitions so easily. He opened his mouth to challenge James's statement, but the sharp look in his son-in-law's eyes made him pause. This wasn't the time or place for a confrontation. Not yet. Well, as long as you're happy, sweetheart, Richard said carefully, locking eyes with his daughter. That's all that matters to me. The tension in the room was palpable as they moved to the dining table. James dominated the conversation, regaling Richard with tales of his business triumphs and future plans. Emily sat quietly, barely touching her food, her eyes darting between her husband and her father. As the evening wore on, Richard observed the subtle dynamics between the couple, the way James would place his hand on Emily's knee, squeezing slightly when she started to speak. The almost imperceptible flinch Emily gave when James's voice rose in excitement over a particular business anecdote. It was like watching a carefully choreographed dance, with James always leading and Emily struggling to keep up. When Emily excused herself to clear the plates, Richard seized the opportunity to speak with James alone. You've done well for yourself, James. The house, the car, the successful business, it's impressive. James leaned back in his chair, swirling the remnants of wine in his glass. Thank you, Richard. I've worked hard to provide the best for Emily. She wants for nothing. Richard nodded, choosing his words carefully. Material comforts are important, certainly, but what about Emily's own aspirations? Her career was taking off when you two married. Surely you don't expect her to give up on her own dreams entirely. A flash of irritation crossed James's face, before his smooth mask slipped back into place. Emily's dreams have evolved, Richard. She understands the importance of presenting a united front in the business world. A wife who's too independent can be a liability in my circles. The implications of James's words hung heavy in the air. Richard felt his jaw clench, but before he could respond, Emily returned to the dining room. Can I get anyone coffee? She asked, her voice unnaturally bright. Or perhaps some dessert? I made your favorite apple pie, James. James smiled up at her, but there was no warmth in his eyes. That sounds lovely, darling. Why don't you bring us each a slice and perhaps some brandy for your father and me? As Emily disappeared back into the kitchen, Richard turned to James, his voice low and controlled. I hope you understand how precious my daughter is to me, James. Her happiness and well-being mean everything. James met Richard's gaze, a challenge glinting in his green eyes. Of course, Richard. Rest assured I have Emily's best interests at heart. Always. The two men stared at each other, the air between them charged with unspoken threats and promises. It was clear to Richard that the battle for Emily's future was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. When Emily returned with the pie and brandy, she found her father and husband locked in what appeared to be a silent standoff. She set down the tray, her hands shaking slightly. Is everything all right? James broke his gaze away from Richard, turning to Emily with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Everything's perfect, darling. Your father and I were just discussing how fortunate we all are. Isn't that right, Richard? Richard forced a smile, reaching out to pat Emily's hand. Of course. Family is the most important thing, after all. As they ate their dessert in strained silence, Richard's mind raced. He knew he couldn't confront James directly, not yet. He needed more information, more proof of what was really happening behind the closed doors of this seemingly perfect home. But one thing was certain: he would not stand by and watch his daughter wither away under the control of this man. As the evening drew to a close and Richard prepared to leave, he hugged Emily tightly, whispering in her ear, I'm here for you, always. Remember that. Emily clung to him for a moment longer than necessary, and Richard felt her tremble slightly before she pulled away, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Driving away from the house, Richard's resolve solidified. He would uncover the truth, no matter what it took. The facade of Emily and James's perfect life was cracking, and Richard was determined to shatter it completely, freeing his daughter from whatever invisible chains bound her to this gilded cage. As the lights of Emily and James's house faded in his rearview mirror, Richard made a silent vow. He would not rest until his daughter was truly free and happy again, even if it meant taking on James and whatever dark secrets he was hiding. The battle for Emily's soul had begun, and Richard was prepared to fight with everything he had. The following morning, Richard sat in his study, the events of the previous evening weighing heavily on his mind. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the plush leather chairs and mahogany bookshelves that lined the walls. But even the warmth of the sun couldn't dispel the chill that had settled in his bones. He picked up his phone, hesitating for a moment before dialing a familiar number. After 2 rings, a gruff voice answered. "Blackwood Investigations, Frank speaking." "Frank, it's Richard Hartley. I need your help with something delicate." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Richard, it's been a while. What's going on?" Richard took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts. "It's about my daughter, Emily, and her husband, James Forrester. Something's not right, Frank. I need you to dig into James's background, his business dealings, everything. Leave no stone unturned." "Sounds serious," Frank replied, his tone softening slightly. "What exactly are we looking for?" "Anything suspicious? Financial irregularities, past relationships, any skeletons in his closet. I have a feeling he's not the man he presents himself to be." "All right, Richard. I'll put my best team on it, but you should know if this guy is as connected as you say, he might have friends in high places. This could get complicated." Richard's jaw clenched. "I don't care how complicated it gets, Frank. My daughter's well-being is at stake. Whatever it costs, whatever it takes, I want the truth." After hanging up, Richard leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the image of Emily on her knees, scrubbing that already spotless floor. What had happened to turn his vibrant, ambitious daughter into this shadow of herself? A soft knock on the study door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called out. Margaret, his housekeeper of 20 years, entered with a tray of coffee. Her kind eyes crinkled with concern as she set the tray down on his desk. "Is everything all right, Mr. Hartley? You seem troubled this morning." Richard managed a weak smile. "Just worried about Emily, Margaret. Did you notice anything?" "Off about her the last time she visited." Margaret hesitated, carefully arranging the coffee cups. "Well, sir, now that you mention it, she did seem a bit different, less talkative, perhaps, and she kept checking her phone as if she was afraid of missing a call." "When was this?" Richard asked, leaning forward. "About 3 months ago, I believe. It was that Sunday brunch you hosted for her birthday." Margaret paused, then added softly, "If you don't mind me saying, sir, she didn't quite seem like herself. There was a sadness in her eyes that wasn't there before." Richard nodded slowly, processing this information. "Thank you, Margaret. Your observations are always valuable." As Margaret left the study, Richard's mind wandered back to that brunch. He'd been so caught up in work at the time that he hadn't paid close attention. Now he struggled to recall the details of that day. Had there been signs even then that he'd missed? Determined to piece together the puzzle, Richard spent the next few hours going through old photos and videos on his computer. He found himself lingering on a video from Emily's college graduation. There she was, radiant in her cap and gown, her eyes sparkling as she talked excitedly about her future plans in marketing. "I'm going to change the world, Dad," she had said, her voice full of determination. "Just you wait and see." The contrast between that Emily and the one he'd seen yesterday was stark. It was as if the light had been slowly drained from her, leaving behind a pale imitation of the daughter he knew and loved. As he continued his digital journey through Emily's past, Richard came across a folder of photos from her wedding day. He clicked through them, his heart heavy. Emily looked beautiful, of course, but even then, there was something off. In many of the photos, James's hand was on her lower back, guiding her. His smile was wide, but his eyes were cold, calculating. One photo in particular caught Richard's attention. It was a candid shot, taken when the couple thought no one was looking. James was leaning in close to Emily, whispering something in her ear. The expression on Emily's face was one of barely concealed fear. Richard sat back, running a hand through his hair. How had he missed this? Had he been so blinded by James's charm and success that he'd failed to see what was happening to his own daughter? Just then, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Frank. "Found something interesting. Can we meet?" Richard's heart raced as he quickly typed a response. "My office, 1 hour." As he waited for Frank to arrive, Richard paced his study, his mind whirling with possibilities. What had Frank uncovered? Would it be enough to help Emily? And more importantly, How could he approach his daughter without pushing her further away? The sound of the doorbell jolted him from his thoughts. As he made his way to greet Frank, Richard steeled himself for whatever revelations were to come. He was ready to face the truth, no matter how ugly it might be. For Emily's sake, he had to be strong. Little did Richard know that the information Frank was about to share would shake the very foundation of everything he thought he knew about James Forrester. The whispers of the past were about to become a deafening roar, and the battle for Emily's future was about to take an unexpected and dangerous turn. As he opened the front door to greet Frank, Richard took a deep breath, preparing himself for the storm that was surely coming. The truth, he realized, was often a double-edged sword. But for Emily, he was willing to wield it, no matter the cost to himself or the carefully constructed world James had built around them. The time for uncovering secrets had begun, and Richard was determined to see it through to the end. As Frank stepped into the house, a manila envelope clutched tightly in his hand. Richard knew that their conversation would be the first step on a long and treacherous journey, one that could either save his daughter or tear their family apart forever. Frank Blackwood settled into one of the plush leather chairs in Richard's study, his weathered face creased with concern. The manila envelope he had brought lay on the coffee table between them, an innocuous object that held the power to change everything. Richard leaned forward, his fingers steepled under his chin. "What have you found, Frank?" Frank took a deep breath, his eyes meeting Richard's. "It's not pretty, Richard. James Forrester isn't who he claims to be." With deliberate movements, Frank opened the envelope and spread its contents on the table. Photographs, financial reports, and legal documents fanned out before them. "Let's start with the basics," Frank began. James Forrester was born James Foster. He changed his name about 10 years ago, right after he finished college. At first, I thought it might be to distance himself from family, but it goes deeper than that. Richard's brow furrowed as he examined a copy of James's original birth certificate. "Why the name change?" Frank's expression darkened. "It seems our friend James has a history of reinventing himself. I found records of 2 previous marriages. Both ended under suspicious circumstances." Richard's head snapped up. 2? But Emily was never told, Frank finished. Both marriages were short-lived, less than a year each, and both ex-wives filed complaints against him. "What kind of complaints?" Richard asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. Frank slid 2 police reports across the table. Emotional abuse, financial manipulation, gaslighting. Sound familiar? Richard felt a chill run down his spine as he remembered Emily's behavior the day before. "Good God," he muttered. "It gets worse," Frank continued. "After each marriage ended, James, or whatever he was calling himself at the time, moved to a different state, changed his name, and started over. He's meticulous about erasing his past." Richard's mind raced. "But surely there were investigations? Court records?" Frank nodded grimly. "That's where it gets interesting. In both cases, the complaints were suddenly dropped. The ex-wives refused to cooperate with investigators, and all charges were dismissed." "How is that possible?" Richard demanded. "Money talks, Richard, and James, or should I say the people behind James, have a lot of it." Frank pulled out a complex web of financial documents. "I traced his funding sources. He's got connections to some powerful people, including your old business partner, Victor Holloway." Richard felt as if the wind had been knocked out of him. Victor Holloway, a name he hadn't heard in years. The man who had nearly destroyed his company in a failed takeover attempt. "Victor, but how—" "It seems Victor's been bankrolling James's ventures for years," Frank explained. "My guess is he's using James as a way to get to you and your company. Emily was just the unwitting pawn in their game." Richard's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles turning white. The pieces were starting to fall into place. James's sudden appearance in Emily's life, his whirlwind courtship, the lavish lifestyle that seemed too good to be true. It had all been orchestrated, a carefully planned attack on Richard's most vulnerable point, his daughter. "There's more," Frank said softly, pulling out a final document. "I found this buried in some old court records. It's a restraining order filed by James's college girlfriend. She never went through with it, but her statement—" Frank trailed off, his eyes filled with concern. Richard took the paper with trembling hands, reading the young woman's account of emotional manipulation, isolation from friends and family, and threats of violence if she ever tried to leave. It was like reading a blueprint for what was happening to Emily. We have to get her out of there, Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. Today. Now. Frank held up a hand. It's not that simple, Richard. James is smart and he's got powerful friends. If we move too quickly, he might do something drastic. We need to be careful, strategic. Richard stood abruptly, pacing the room. You don't understand, Frank. Every minute she stays in that house, she's in danger. I can't just sit here and do nothing. I'm not saying do nothing, Frank replied calmly. But we need to approach this delicately. Emily's been under his influence for years. She might not be ready to hear the truth, let alone leave him. Richard stopped pacing, turning to face Frank. So what do you suggest? Frank leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. We gather more evidence, build an ironclad case that even James's connections can't dismiss. And most importantly, we need to get Emily to open up, to see the situation for what it is. And how do we do that? Richard asked, frustration evident in his voice. Slowly, Frank replied. We start by reconnecting with her, rebuilding her trust. Maybe arrange some situations where she's away from James. Give her a chance to remember who she used to be. Richard nodded slowly, his mind already formulating plans. I could invite her to lunch, just the two of us. Or maybe a spa day with some of her old friends. That's a good start, Frank agreed. But we also need to dig deeper into James's business dealings. If we can prove he's involved in anything illegal, it might be enough to get the authorities involved despite his connections. As they continued to discuss strategy, Richard felt a glimmer of hope for the first time since his visit to Emily's house. It wouldn't be easy, and the road ahead was fraught with danger, but at least now they had a plan. Just as they were wrapping up their meeting, Richard's phone buzzed with a text message. His heart skipped a beat when he saw it was from Emily. Dad, can we meet for coffee tomorrow? There's something I need to talk to you about. Please don't tell James. Richard showed the message to Frank, his expression a mix of hope and concern. Frank nodded gravely. This could be our opening, Richard. But remember, take it slow. We don't want to spook her or alert James. As Frank gathered his documents and prepared to leave, Richard felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battle for Emily's freedom was far from over, but now they had a fighting chance. Looking out the window at the setting sun, Richard made a silent promise to his daughter. He would unravel the web of lies James had spun, no matter how long it took or what it cost him. And someday soon, he would see Emily smile again, truly smile, free from the shadows of deception that had darkened her life for far too long. With determination in his heart and Frank's revelations weighing heavily on his mind, Richard began to prepare for his meeting with Emily. Tomorrow would be a turning point, he hoped, the first step on the long journey to bringing his daughter back into the light. The quaint coffee shop on the corner of Maple and Oak was bustling with the mid-morning crowd when Richard arrived. He scanned the room, his heart racing when he spotted Emily tucked away in a corner booth, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug. She looked small, almost fragile in her oversized sweater. As Richard made his way through the maze of tables, he forced himself to take slow, deep breaths. Frank's words echoed in his mind. Take it slow. Don't spook her. He had to play this carefully. Emily, he said softly as he approached the table. She looked up, a wan smile touching her lips. Hi, Dad. Richard slid into the booth across from her, taking in the dark circles under her eyes and the way her collarbone protruded sharply against her pale skin. She had lost weight since he'd last seen her, and not in a healthy way. I'm glad you reached out, Richard began, keeping his tone gentle. How are you doing, sweetheart? Emily's fingers tightened around her mug. I'm okay, Dad. Thanks for meeting me. A waitress appeared and Richard ordered a black coffee, using the interruption to gather his thoughts. When they were alone again, he leaned in slightly. You said there was something you wanted to talk about? Emily bit her lower lip, her eyes darting around the cafe as if checking for eavesdroppers. I don't know where to start, she whispered. Richard reached across the table, gently placing his hand over hers. Start wherever you feel comfortable, Em. I'm here to listen. Taking a shaky breath, Emily began to speak, her voice barely audible over the cafe's ambient noise. Things with James. They're not what they seem, Dad. I thought I could handle it, that I could make things work, but she trailed off, blinking rapidly as tears threatened to spill. Richard's heart ached to see his once confident daughter so broken. Emily, he said softly, whatever it is, you can tell me. I'm here for you no matter what. She nodded, taking another deep breath. James, he's not the man I thought he was. He controls everything. Our money, my schedule, who I talk to. I can't even go grocery shopping without his permission. Richard felt a surge of anger, but forced it down, maintaining a calm exterior. How long has this been going on? It started small, Emily continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. A comment here, a suggestion there. He'd say things like, "Don't you think that shirt is a little revealing for a business dinner?" Or, "Why don't you let me handle the finances? You've got enough on your plate." She paused, taking a sip of her now lukewarm tea. Before I knew it, I was second-guessing every decision, and then... Emily's voice broke and a tear slid down her cheek. Richard handed her a napkin, waiting patiently for her to continue. "Last week I ran into an old colleague from my marketing days. We chatted for a few minutes and I mentioned how much I missed working. When I got home, James was furious. He accused me of trying to undermine him, of not being supportive enough. He broke my phone and told me I couldn't leave the house without his permission." Richard's blood ran cold as he remembered the scene he had walked in on. Emily frantically cleaning an already spotless bathroom. It all made sense now. "Emily," he said, his voice low and urgent, "you know this isn't right, don't you? What James is doing. It's abuse." Emily flinched at the word but nodded slowly. "I know. I think I've known for a while, but I was scared. I still am. James has friends in high places, Dad. He's always talking about how he could ruin someone's career with a single phone call." Richard squeezed her hand gently. "You don't have to be scared anymore, Em. We can get you out of there. Today, if you want." To his surprise, Emily pulled her hand away, shaking her head. "It's not that simple, Dad. James, he's got dirt on you, on the company. He says if I ever try to leave, he'll destroy everything you've built." Richard felt as if the wind had been knocked out of him. So this was Victor Holloway's endgame, using James to get to him through Emily. "Listen to me, Emily," he said firmly. "Whatever James thinks he has on me, it doesn't matter. Your safety and happiness are all that's important." Emily looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "But what if—" "No what-ifs," Richard interrupted gently. "We'll face whatever comes together. You're not alone in this, sweetheart." For the first time since they sat down, a genuine smile touched Emily's lips. "I've missed you, Dad. I've missed me." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. "I've missed you too, Em. More than you know." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the weight of their conversation settling around them. Finally, Emily spoke again, her voice stronger than before. "So what do we do now?" Richard leaned back, his mind racing. "First, we get you somewhere safe. I have a cabin up in the mountains. James doesn't know about it. You can stay there while we figure out our next move." Emily nodded slowly. "Okay, but how do I leave without James suspecting anything?" "We'll need a distraction," Richard mused. "Something that will keep James occupied long enough for you to pack a bag and get out." Just then, Richard's phone buzzed. It was a text from Frank. "Got more info on Jay's business dealings. Meeting set up with DA tomorrow. Things are moving fast." An idea began to form in Richard's mind. "Emily, do you trust me?" She nodded without hesitation. "With my life." "Good, because I have a plan. It's risky, but if it works, we'll not only get you out safely, but also ensure that James can never hurt anyone else again." As Richard began to outline his plan, he saw a spark of the old Emily returning, the fierce, determined woman who had once declared she would change the world. It was a fragile hope, but it was there, growing stronger with each passing moment. For the first time in years, Richard felt truly optimistic about the future. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with legal battles and emotional hurdles. But looking at Emily now, seeing the strength returning to her eyes, he knew it would all be worth it. As they left the cafe, making plans to put their scheme into motion, Richard couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. The game was about to change, and James Forrester would never see it coming. Little did they know, however, that James had his own plans in motion, plans that would test their newfound alliance to its very limits. The battle for Emily's freedom was far from over, and the most dangerous challenges were yet to come. The sun was setting as Richard's car pulled up to the secluded mountain cabin. The dense forest surrounding the property cast long shadows across the gravel driveway, creating an atmosphere of isolation that was both comforting and eerie. Emily sat in the passenger seat, her small duffel bag clutched tightly to her chest, her eyes wide as she took in their surroundings. "We're here," Richard said softly, turning off the engine. "How are you holding up?" Emily managed a weak smile. "I'm okay, just nervous, I guess. It all happened so fast." Richard nodded, understanding the whirlwind of emotions his daughter must be experiencing. In the span of just a few hours, they had set their plan in motion. A carefully orchestrated business emergency had drawn James away from the house, giving Emily the window she needed to pack a bag and slip away unnoticed. As they stepped out of the car, the crisp mountain air filled their lungs. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. "It's so quiet here," she murmured. "That's the idea," Richard replied, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You'll be safe here while we sort everything out." They made their way up the wooden steps to the cabin's front porch. Richard unlocked the door, ushering Emily inside. The interior was cozy but spacious, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall of the living room. Large windows offered panoramic views of the surrounding forest. "It's beautiful," Emily said, her voice filled with awe as she took in the rustic yet comfortable furnishings. Richard smiled, pleased to see a spark of genuine emotion from his daughter. "I'm glad you like it. I've always found this place peaceful. It's a good spot to clear your head and heal." Emily's expression sobered at his words. She set her bag down and sank onto the plush sofa, suddenly looking very small and vulnerable. "Dad, what if this doesn't work? What if James finds out where I am?" Richard sat beside her, taking her hands in his. "Emily, listen to me. James doesn't know about this place. No one does except for Frank. And we've taken every precaution to ensure your safety. Your phone is off and locked away. We used cash for everything, and I've got trusted people watching the roads leading up here." He paused, making sure she was looking him in the eye before continuing. "I promise you, Emily, you're safe here." Emily nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. I can't believe I let things get this bad. I should have seen the signs earlier. I should have been stronger." Richard felt his heart break at her words. "No, sweetheart, this is not your fault. James is a master manipulator. He's done this before, and he knew exactly how to break down your defenses." Emily looked up, surprise evident on her face. "Before? What do you mean?" Richard hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. But looking at his daughter's questioning gaze, he knew she deserved the truth. "Frank did some digging. James, he's been married before. Twice, actually. And both times, the women reported similar behavior." Emily's face paled. "Twice? But he told me. He said I was his first real love." "I'm so sorry, Em," Richard said softly. "There's a lot about James that we're just uncovering. But that's why we're here now. To get you away from him and to make sure he can't do this to anyone else." Emily was quiet for a long moment, processing this new information. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "All this time, I thought I was crazy, that I was imagining things or overreacting. But he made me doubt everything about myself." Richard pulled her into a tight hug, feeling her body shake with silent sobs. "You're not crazy, Emily. You're one of the strongest people I know, and we're going to get through this together." As Emily's tears subsided, Richard gently pulled away. "Why don't you get settled in? There's a bedroom upstairs with an ensuite bathroom. I'll get a fire going and start on some dinner." Emily nodded, wiping her eyes. "Thanks, Dad, for everything." As Emily made her way upstairs with her bag, Richard busied himself with building a fire and preparing a simple meal in the kitchen. His mind raced with all that needed to be done. Frank would be meeting with the district attorney tomorrow, presenting the evidence they had gathered against James. If all went well, they might be able to bring charges against him within days. But Richard knew they couldn't afford to be complacent. James was cunning and had powerful allies. They needed to be prepared for anything. Just as Richard was setting out plates for dinner, his phone buzzed with a text from Frank. "Jay back home, asking questions. Be careful." Richard's jaw clenched. So it began. He quickly typed back, "E safe. Proceeding as planned. Keep me posted." "Dad?" Emily's voice came from the stairs. She had changed into comfortable clothes, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked younger, more vulnerable, but there was a calmness about her that hadn't been there before. "Everything okay?" she asked, noticing his furrowed brow. Richard forced a smile. Everything's fine, sweetheart. Just checking in with Frank. Dinner's almost ready. As they sat down to eat, Richard couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. Relief that Emily was safe, anger at what James had put her through, and anxiety about what was to come. But looking at his daughter across the table, seeing her slowly relax in the safety of the cabin, he knew that every risk was worth it. They talked late into the night, Emily opening up more about her experiences with James, Richard offering support and reassurance. It was a bittersweet reunion, tinged with the pain of lost time but filled with hope for the future. As they finally said goodnight and Emily headed up to bed, Richard stood by the large windows, looking out into the darkness. He knew that somewhere out there, James was realizing his carefully constructed world was crumbling, and like a cornered animal, he would be at his most dangerous. Richard's hand tightened on his phone, Frank's warning echoing in his mind. The calm of the mountain retreat was deceptive. A storm was coming, and they needed to be ready. With a deep breath, Richard turned away from the window, his resolve stronger than ever. Whatever James threw at them, he would face it head-on. For Emily's sake, for the sake of all the women James had hurt, he would see this through to the end. As he climbed the stairs to his own room, Richard paused outside Emily's door, listening. The soft, even breathing he heard from within brought a smile to his face. For the first time in years, his daughter was sleeping peacefully, free from fear. And Richard vowed to himself that he would do everything in his power to ensure she stayed that way, no matter the cost. The early morning light filtered through the cabin windows, casting a warm glow across the rustic interior. Emily stood at the kitchen counter, sipping a cup of steaming coffee, her gaze fixed on the serene forest outside. For the first time in years, she had slept through the night without waking in a cold sweat, plagued by anxiety. Richard entered the kitchen, his face etched with a mix of concern and determination. "Morning, sweetheart. How did you sleep?" Emily turned, offering a small but genuine smile. "Better than I have in a long time, Dad." "Thank you." Richard nodded, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Good. You needed the rest. We've got a big day ahead of us." As they settled at the kitchen table, Richard's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his expression tightening slightly. "It's Frank. He's meeting with the DA in an hour." Emily's hands tightened around her mug. Do you think they'll be able to bring charges against James?" Richard reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. "Frank's got a solid case, Em. But even if the DA doesn't move forward immediately, we've got other options. The important thing is that you're safe now." Emily nodded, but Richard could see the conflict in her eyes. "What is it, sweetheart?" She took a deep breath. "So it's just part of me still can't believe this is happening. Yesterday morning I was making James's breakfast, terrified of disappointing him. And now you're free," Richard finished gently. "Am I, though?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I keep thinking about what James might do when he realizes I'm gone. He's got connections, Dad. What if he comes after you? Or the company?" Richard's jaw set in a determined line. "Let him try. We've got evidence of his past, Emily. His previous marriages, the complaints against him, his financial manipulations. He's not as untouchable as he thinks." Just then, Richard's phone rang. It was Frank. Richard put it on speaker. "Frank, you're on with Emily and me." "What's the news?" Frank's gruff voice filled the kitchen. "The DA's moving forward, Richard. They're preparing to issue an arrest warrant for James on charges of financial fraud, emotional abuse, and coercive control." Emily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Richard squeezed her other hand reassuringly. "That's great news, Frank. What's our next move?" "The DA wants to talk to Emily," Frank replied. "Her testimony could be crucial in building the case, but there's something else you should know." Richard tensed. "What is it?" Frank sighed heavily. "James knows Emily's gone. He's been making calls, Richard. Big ones. I've got sources telling me he's trying to liquidate assets and transfer funds offshore. He's preparing to run." Richard's mind raced. If James fled before they could bring him to justice, all their efforts could be for nothing. "We need to move fast, Frank. Can you arrange a secure way for Emily to meet with the DA?" "Already on it," Frank assured them. "I've got a trusted team ready to escort her to a safe location for the meeting. We can do it this afternoon if Emily's up for it." All eyes turned to Emily. She sat still for a moment, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. Then slowly she nodded. "I'll do it. I need to do it. For myself, and for all the other women he might hurt, if we don't stop him. Pride swelled in Richard's chest. "That's my girl," he said softly. They spent the next hour making arrangements. Frank's team would arrive at the cabin by helicopter to avoid using the roads, minimizing the risk of being followed. Emily would be taken to a secure location to meet with the DA, while Richard coordinated with their legal team to prepare for the inevitable media storm. As Emily packed a small bag for the trip, Richard stepped outside onto the cabin's porch, needing a moment to collect his thoughts. The forest was quiet, a stark contrast to the whirlwind of activity about to unfold. He was so lost in thought that he almost missed the sound of a twig snapping in the nearby underbrush. Richard's head snapped up, his eyes scanning the tree line. For a split second, he could have sworn he saw a figure duck behind a large oak tree. Heart racing, Richard hurried back inside, locking the door behind him. "Emily," he called out, trying to keep his voice calm. "Are you almost ready? We might need to move up our timetable." Emily appeared at the top of the stairs, bag in hand. "I'm ready." "Dad? What's wrong?" "You look pale." Richard forced a smile. "Just anxious to get things moving. Why don't you double-check you have everything while I make a quick call to Frank?" As Emily retreated to her room, Richard dialed Frank's number, speaking in hushed tones. "Frank, I think we might have company. Can you get that helicopter here any faster?" Frank's response was immediate. "On it. Sit tight and stay alert. We'll be there in 20 minutes." The next quarter hour was tense. Richard and Emily sat in the living room away from the windows, speaking in whispers. Richard had briefly explained his suspicions, and Emily's face was a mask of barely contained fear. "How could he have found us?" she whispered. Richard shook his head. "I don't know, sweetheart, but we're not going to let him get to you. I promise." The distant thrum of helicopter blades was the sweetest sound Richard had ever heard. As the aircraft descended into the small clearing near the cabin, Richard and Emily made a dash for it, Richard's eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Just as they reached the helicopter, a figure burst from the tree line. James, his face contorted with rage, sprinted towards them. "Emily," he roared, "don't you dare leave!" For a moment, Emily froze, years of conditioning taking hold. But then, with a strength that surprised even her, she turned to face her husband. "It's over, James," she called out, her voice steady. "I'm not your prisoner anymore." With that, she climbed into the helicopter. Richard followed, slamming the door shut just as James reached them. The last thing they saw as the aircraft lifted off was James's face, a mix of fury and disbelief, growing smaller as they ascended. As the cabin and the forest fell away beneath them, Emily let out a shaky breath. "I did it," she whispered, almost in disbelief. "I really did it." Richard pulled her into a tight hug. "You did, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you." As they flew towards the city and the meeting that would change everything, Richard knew that the hardest part of their journey was just beginning. James wouldn't give up easily, and the legal battle ahead would be brutal. But looking at Emily, seeing the determination in her eyes, Richard felt a surge of hope. They had taken the first step towards justice, towards freedom. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The helicopter soared through the clear sky, carrying them towards an uncertain but hopeful future. The ripples of change they had set in motion were about to become a tidal wave, and nothing would ever be the same again. The helicopter touched down on the rooftop helipad of a nondescript office building in downtown Hartford, Connecticut. As the rotors slowed to a stop, Richard and Emily were greeted by Frank Blackwood and a stern-faced woman in a crisp suit. "Richard, Emily," Frank nodded, his voice raised over the dying whine of the engine. "This is District Attorney Sarah Pearson. She's been briefed on the situation." DA Pearson extended her hand first to Richard, then to Emily. "Ms. Hartley, Mr. Hartley, thank you for coming. We have a lot to discuss and not much time." They were quickly ushered inside, descending in a private elevator to a conference room several floors below. As they settled around the large oak table, Emily couldn't help but feel a mix of exhaustion and adrenaline coursing through her veins. DA Pearson wasted no time getting to the point. "Ms. Hartley, I understand how difficult this must be for you, but I need you to walk me through your relationship with James Forrester. From the beginning. Every detail could be crucial." Emily took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "We met at a charity gala 3 years ago. James was charming, attentive. He made me feel special, like I was the only person in the room. As Emily recounted the whirlwind romance, the subtle ways James had isolated her from friends and family, and the gradual erosion of her independence, Richard felt a mix of guilt and anger. How had he not seen this happening? "When did you first realize something was wrong?" D.A. Pearson asked, her pen poised over a legal pad. Emily's voice quavered slightly. I think part of me always knew, but there was a moment, about a year into our marriage. I had lunch with an old college friend, and when I got home, James was furious. He accused me of trying to embarrass him, of not being supportive enough. He threw my phone against the wall, shattering it. That was the first time I was truly afraid of him. As Emily continued her testimony, detailing the financial control, the emotional manipulation, and the constant fear she lived under, Richard noticed Frank slipping out of the room, phone in hand. A few minutes later, he returned, his face grim. "Sorry to interrupt," Frank said, addressing the group, "but we've got a situation. James is holding a press conference. He's about to go live." D.A. Pearson's eyes narrowed. "Put it on the screen." The large monitor on the wall flickered to life, showing James standing at a podium, his face a mask of concern. Camera flashes popped as he began to speak. "Good afternoon. I come before you today with a heavy heart. My beloved wife, Emily, has gone missing." Emily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Richard's fists clenched under the table. James continued, his voice choking with what appeared to be emotion. "I fear that she may be under the influence of individuals who do not have her best interests at heart. To those who may be holding her, please let her come home. Emily, if you can hear this, know that I love you and I'm doing everything in my power to bring you back safely." D.A. Pearson muted the broadcast, turning to Emily. "He's trying to control the narrative. Miss Hartley, we need to move quickly. Are you willing to make a statement of your own?" Emily hesitated, her eyes wide with fear. I don't know if I can face the cameras. What if I freeze up? What if no one believes me?" Richard placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You can do this, Em. You're stronger than you know." Emily looked at her father, then back to D.A. Pearson. Slowly, she nodded. "Okay, I'll do it. But what do I say?" For the next hour, they worked on crafting Emily's statement. D.A. Pearson advised on the legal aspects, while Richard and Frank helped Emily find the words to tell her truth. As they worked, updates on James's press conference trickled in. He had painted himself as the devoted husband, worried sick about his fragile wife who had not been herself lately. Finally, they were ready. Emily stood before a mirror, smoothing her hair and taking deep breaths. Richard watched her, marveling at the strength he saw emerging in his daughter. "You've got this, sweetheart," he said softly. "Just tell the truth, your truth." Emily nodded, squaring her shoulders. As they made their way to the room where the press was gathered, she reached for her father's hand, squeezing it tightly. The room fell silent as Emily approached the podium, cameras flashing and reporters leaning forward in anticipation. For a moment, she froze, the sea of faces before her, overwhelming. Then, she felt her father's reassuring presence behind her, and she found her voice. "Good afternoon. My name is Emily Hartley, and I am here of my own free will." Her voice, shaky at first, grew stronger with each word. "For the past 3 years, I have been living in fear, trapped in a marriage built on lies and manipulation. James Forrester is not the man he pretends to be. He is a master of deception who has systematically isolated me from my friends and family, controlled every aspect of my life, and made me doubt my own sanity." As Emily continued, detailing the emotional and financial abuse she had endured, the room was silent, save for the click of cameras and the scratch of pens on notepads. Richard watched with a mix of pride and sorrow as his daughter bared her soul to the world. "I am not missing. I am not confused or under anyone's influence. I am, for the first time in years, free, and I am here to ensure that James Forrester can never do to another woman what he did to me." With that, Emily stepped back from the podium. The room erupted in a cacophony of questions, but D.A. Pearson quickly took control, explaining that charges were being filed against James Forrester and that an investigation was ongoing. As they were escorted from the room, Emily leaned heavily against her father, the adrenaline of the moment fading. "Did I do okay?" she asked, her voice small. Richard hugged her tightly. "You were magnificent, Em. Absolutely magnificent. Back in the conference room, they watched as news channels picked up Emily's statement, running it side by side with James's earlier press conference. The contrast was stark, James's polished performance versus Emily's raw emotional truth. Frank's phone buzzed. He read the message, a grim smile spreading across his face. They've got him. James was picked up trying to board a private jet at a small airstrip outside the city. He's in custody. A collective sigh of relief filled the room. Emily sank into a chair, tears flowing freely now. It's really over, isn't it? Richard knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. This part is over, yes, but we've got a long road ahead, sweetheart. Are you ready for what comes next? Emily wiped her eyes, a determined look replacing the tears. I'm ready, Dad. Whatever it takes, I'm ready. As the sun set over Hartford, casting long shadows through the conference room windows, Richard knew that they had won a significant battle, but the war was far from over. James had resources, connections. The legal fight ahead would be brutal. But looking at Emily, seeing the strength and resolve in her eyes, Richard felt a surge of hope. They had taken the hardest step, breaking the silence, exposing the truth. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The eye of the storm had passed, and though turbulent times still lay ahead, Richard knew that they were on the path to healing, to justice, and to a future where Emily could finally reclaim her life and her dreams. As they prepared to leave the building, surrounded by a protective detail arranged by Frank, Richard made a silent vow. He would see this through to the end, no matter the cost. For Emily, for all the women James had hurt, and for the countless others who suffered in silence. The storm might rage on, but they would stand strong, a beacon of hope in the darkness. The days following Emily's press conference were a whirlwind of activity. The Hartley name, once associated with business success and philanthropy, now dominated headlines for a very different reason. Millionaire's daughter escapes abusive marriage. James Forrester, charming businessman or calculated abuser. The media frenzy was relentless. Richard had moved Emily into his penthouse apartment, where a rotating team of security personnel kept watch 24/7. As they sat in the living room, watching yet another news report about the case, Emily sighed heavily. I never wanted this kind of attention, she said, her voice tinged with exhaustion. Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing by going public. Richard muted the TV and turned to his daughter. Emily, look at me. When she met his gaze, he continued, You did an incredibly brave thing. Not just for yourself, but for every person out there who's trapped in a situation like yours. Just then, Frank entered the room, a stack of files under his arm. Sorry to interrupt, he said, his gruff voice softening slightly when he saw Emily's drawn face. But we've got some new information you both need to see. As Frank spread the files on the coffee table, Richard and Emily leaned in. What are we looking at, Frank? Richard asked. These, Frank said, tapping a file, are statements from James's previous wives. They've both come forward, inspired by Emily's courage. Emily's eyes widened as she picked up one of the statements. This is almost exactly what happened to me, she whispered, her voice trembling. Frank nodded grimly. The pattern is clear. James perfected his tactics over time, but that's not all. He pulled out another file. We've also uncovered evidence of extensive financial fraud. It seems James was using his marriages as cover for some pretty sophisticated embezzlement schemes. Richard's jaw clenched. How deep does this go, Frank? Deep, Frank replied. We're talking millions of dollars, funneled through a network of shell companies. And here's where it gets really interesting. He paused, making sure he had their full attention. Some of these transactions can be traced back to none other than Victor Holloway. The name hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Richard felt a chill run down his spine. Victor Holloway, his former business partner, the man who had nearly destroyed his company years ago in a failed takeover attempt. Emily looked between her father and Frank, confusion evident on her face. Who's Victor Holloway? Richard took a deep breath, realizing it was time to share a part of his past he'd long kept buried. Victor was my business partner when I first started out. He was brilliant, charismatic, and utterly ruthless. When the company started to take off, he tried to push me out, to take control. Emily listened intently as Richard recounted the bitter legal battle that had ensued, how he had ultimately prevailed, but at great personal cost. I thought it was over, Richard concluded. I never imagined he'd stoop to something like this. Frank cleared his throat. There's more. We have reason to believe that James's pursuit of Emily wasn't random. It looks like he specifically targeted her as part of a larger plan orchestrated by Holloway. The room fell silent as the implications of this revelation sank in. Emily's face paled. So, our entire relationship was a lie from the very beginning. He never cared for me at all. Richard reached out, taking Emily's hand in his. Emily, listen to me. None of this is your fault. You were a pawn in their game, but you're the one who had the strength to break free. Emily nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes. I feel so stupid. How could I not have seen it? You're not stupid, Emily, Frank interjected, his usually gruff voice gentle. James and Holloway are master manipulators. They've been playing this game for years. As they continued to pore over the files, a plan began to take shape. With the evidence they now had, they could not only build a case against James, but potentially bring down Holloway's entire operation. It won't be easy, Frank warned. Holloway has connections in high places. He'll fight dirty. Richard's eyes hardened with determination. So will we. It's time to end this, once and for all. As the day wore on, they strategized, made calls, and prepared for the legal battle ahead. Emily, though still shaken by the revelations, threw herself into the work. Richard watched with pride as his daughter's strength and resilience shone through. That night, as a storm raged outside the penthouse windows, Richard found Emily standing in the darkened living room, staring out at the city lights below. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked softly. Emily turned, a small smile on her face. "I was just thinking about Mom, about how proud she'd be of us for fighting back." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. Emily's mother, his beloved wife, had passed away when Emily was just a teenager. "She would be incredibly proud of you, Em, just as I am." Emily leaned into her father's embrace. "Dad, I'm scared," she admitted, "but I'm also excited. Is that weird? For the first time in years, I feel like I'm actually living, not just existing." Richard hugged her tighter. "It's not weird at all, sweetheart. It's a sign that you're healing, that you're reclaiming your life." As they stood there, father and daughter united against the storm, both outside and in their lives, Richard felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be challenging, fraught with legal battles and emotional hurdles, but they would face it together. The echoes of the past, James's previous victims, Holloway's long-held grudge, had resurfaced, threatening to overwhelm them. But Richard knew that these echoes also held the key to their victory. By confronting the past, they would secure a better future, not just for Emily, but for all those who had suffered at the hands of men like James and Holloway. As the storm outside began to subside, Richard made a silent vow. He would see this through to the end, no matter the cost. For Emily, for the memory of his wife, and for the countless others who had been silenced by abuse and manipulation. The battle was far from over, but with each passing day, with each small victory, they were one step closer to justice. And in that moment, watching his daughter stand tall and unbroken, Richard knew that they had already won the most important fight of all, the fight for Emily's freedom and self-worth. The echoes of the past would not define their future. Instead, they would use those echoes to build a symphony of justice, hope, and healing. The following weeks were a blur of legal meetings, strategy sessions, and emotional ups and downs. Emily, determined to take an active role in building the case against James and Holloway, threw herself into the work with a fervor that both impressed and concerned Richard. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves swirled outside the windows of Richard's home office, the core team gathered for an update. Frank Blackwood stood at the head of the table, his weathered face grim as he addressed the group. "All right, folks, here's where we stand," he began, spreading out a series of documents. "We've got solid evidence of James's financial fraud, corroborating statements from his previous wives, and a paper trail linking several shell companies to Holloway's main business interests." DA Sarah Pearson, who had become a staunch ally, nodded approvingly. "It's a strong case, but Holloway's legal team is already moving to discredit our witnesses and suppress key evidence." Emily, who had been quietly taking notes, looked up. "What about the other women? James's ex-wives and the others we've found? Are they safe?" Frank's expression softened slightly. "We've got protection details on all of them, Emily. But I won't lie to you. Holloway's people have been making threats, trying to scare them into silence. Richard watched as a range of emotions played across his daughter's face. Fear, anger, and finally, determination. "We can't let them win," Emily said, her voice steady. "Not after everything these women have been through." "We won't," Richard assured her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "But we need to be prepared for a long, difficult fight." As the meeting continued, they discussed various strategies for countering Holloway's moves. Legal maneuvers, public relations campaigns, and even plans for personal security were all laid out in meticulous detail. Midway through the session, Frank's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his brow furrowing. "Excuse me, I need to take this," he said, stepping out of the room. When he returned a few minutes later, his face was ashen. "We've got a problem," he announced. "One of our key witnesses, James's first wife, Sarah Thompson, she's gone missing." The room erupted in a flurry of questions and exclamations. Emily, her face pale, turned to Richard. "Dad, this is my fault. If I hadn't gone public, if I hadn't encouraged them to come forward—" "Stop right there," Richard said firmly. "This is not your fault, Emily. This is Holloway showing his true colors. And we're going to find Sarah and make sure she's safe." D.A. Pearson was already on her phone, coordinating with local law enforcement. Frank huddled with his team, mobilizing his network of contacts. In the midst of the chaos, Richard noticed Emily slip quietly out of the room. He found her in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. "Em?" he said softly, approaching her cautiously. Emily turned, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I thought I was doing the right thing, Dad. I thought by speaking out, I was helping others. But what if I've just put them in more danger?" Richard pulled her into a tight embrace. "Listen to me, sweetheart. You did do the right thing. Holloway and James, they thrive on silence and fear. By speaking out, you've given others the courage to do the same. And yes, it's dangerous, but staying silent was dangerous too." Emily nodded against his chest, taking a shaky breath. I know you're right. It's just overwhelming sometimes." "I know it is," Richard said, stroking her hair gently. "But you're not alone in this. We're all here fighting alongside you." As they stood there, finding strength in each other's presence, Frank appeared in the doorway. "We've got a lead on Sarah," he announced. "A neighbor reported seeing a suspicious van outside her house last night. We're tracking it now." Emily straightened, wiping her eyes. "What can I do to help?" Frank hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Actually, there might be something. Sarah's sister has been trying to reach her. She might be more comfortable talking to you, Emily, if you're up for it, of course." Emily took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "I'm up for it. Let's do this." As they made their way back to the office, Richard marveled at his daughter's resilience. The Emily of just a few months ago would have crumbled under this pressure. But now, despite her fears and doubts, she was standing tall, ready to fight, not just for herself, but for others. The next few hours were tense as they worked to locate Sarah. Emily spent much of that time on the phone with Sarah's sister, offering comfort and gathering potentially useful information. Her natural empathy and newfound strength shone through, and Richard couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. Finally, as the sun was setting, Frank burst into the room. "We've found her," he announced. "Sarah's safe. Local PD picked her up at a bus station 2 states over. Looks like she got spooked by some threats and decided to run." The relief in the room was palpable. Emily sank into a chair, exhausted but smiling. "Is she okay? Can I talk to her?" Frank nodded. "She's shaken up, but physically fine. And yes, she's asking to speak with you, Emily. Says you're the reason she found the courage to come forward in the first place." As Emily took the call in private, Richard pulled Frank aside. "How bad is it really, Frank?" "Holloway's playing hardball." Frank's expression was grim. "It's bad, Richard. Holloway's desperate, and a desperate man is dangerous. We need to be prepared for anything." Richard nodded, his jaw set with determination. "Then we'll be ready. Whatever it takes, we're seeing this through." As the day drew to a close and the team began to disperse, Richard found Emily standing by the window, phone still in hand, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" he asked. Emily turned, a small smile playing on her lips. "You know, Dad, for the first time in a long time, I think it will be. Talking to Sarah, hearing her story, it reminded me why we're doing this. It's bigger than just me now." Richard pulled her into a side hug. "It always was, Em. You just needed to find your voice again." As they stood there, watching the city lights flicker to life in the gathering dusk, Richard knew that the storm was far from over. Holloway would strike again, possibly harder next time. The legal battles ahead would be grueling, the emotional toll immense, but looking at Emily, seeing the quiet strength and determination in her eyes, Richard felt a sense of hope. They had weathered the first waves of the storm, and they had emerged stronger. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The gathering storm might rage on, but they had found their anchor in each other, and in the righteous cause they fought for. And in that moment, as father and daughter stood united against the encroaching darkness, Richard knew that they had already won the most important battle of all, the battle for Emily's spirit, for her future, and for the hope of all those who had suffered in silence for too long. The storm might gather, but they would stand firm, a beacon of light and hope in the darkness. As the legal proceedings against James Forrester and Victor Holloway intensified, the pressure on Emily and Richard Hartley grew exponentially. The media circus showed no signs of abating, and each day seemed to bring a new challenge or setback. One rainy afternoon, Emily sat in her father's study, poring over depositions and financial records. The strain of the past few weeks was evident in the dark circles under her eyes and the tension in her shoulders. Richard watched her from the doorway, his heart heavy with concern. "Em," he said softly, "why don't you take a break? You've been at this for hours." Emily looked up, blinking as if coming out of a trance. "I can't, Dad. There's too much at stake. If we miss something, if we let them slip through on some technicality." Richard crossed the room, gently closing the laptop in front of her. "I know, sweetheart, but you won't be any good to anyone if you burn yourself out. Come on, let's get some fresh air." Reluctantly, Emily allowed her father to lead her out onto the balcony. The rain had stopped, leaving the air crisp and clean. As they looked out over the city skyline, a comfortable silence fell between them. Suddenly, Emily's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, her brow furrowing. "It's an unknown number," she murmured, hesitating before answering. "Hello?" Richard watched as Emily's expression shifted from confusion to shock. Yes, of course, we'll be there. Thank you." As she hung up, Emily turned to her father, her eyes wide. "Dad, you're not going to believe this. That was Catherine Holloway, Victor's wife. She wants to meet with us." Richard's jaw dropped. "Catherine? But why would she—" "She says she has information," Emily replied, her voice tinged with excitement and apprehension. "Information that could blow the whole case wide open." Within the hour, they were seated in a discreet booth at a quiet cafe across town. Catherine Holloway was a striking woman in her early 50s, her elegant appearance belying the tension evident in her tightly clasped hands. "Thank you for meeting me," Catherine began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been following your case, Ms. Hartley. Your courage. It inspired me to finally take action." Emily leaned forward, her voice gentle. "What can you tell us, Mrs. Holloway?" Catherine took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Victor, he's not the man I married. Over the years, I've watched him become consumed by greed and bitterness. At first, I turned a blind eye, but when I realized the extent of what he was doing, the lives he was destroying, I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer." As Catherine spoke, she revealed a web of corruption far more extensive than they had imagined. Shell companies, offshore accounts, blackmail and bribery. Victor Holloway's reach extended into the highest echelons of business and politics. "But the final straw," Catherine continued, her voice breaking slightly, "was when I discovered his connection to James Forrester. The way they targeted you, Miss Hartley. It was unconscionable." Richard, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "Catherine, I can't imagine how difficult this must be for you, but your testimony could be crucial in bringing Victor and James to justice." Catherine nodded, a mix of fear and determination in her eyes. "I know. That's why I'm here. I'm ready to tell everything I know to the authorities. But I'm afraid Victor has powerful friends. If he suspects I've turned on him—" Emily reached across the table, gently placing her hand over Catherine's. "We'll protect you, Mrs. Holloway. You're not alone in this fight anymore." As they left the cafe, plans in place for Catherine to meet with the DA, Richard couldn't shake a sense of unease. "This could be the break we've been waiting for," he mused, "but it also raises the stakes significantly. Holloway will be desperate when he realizes his own wife has turned against him. Emily nodded, her face set with determination. Then we'll need to be extra vigilant. But Dad, don't you see? This is how we win. Not just in court, but in the court of public opinion. Every person who speaks out, every ally we gain, it chips away at the foundation of fear and silence that men like Holloway and James rely on. Richard couldn't help but smile, marveling at his daughter's strength and insight. When did you become so wise, Em? Emily's answering smile was tinged with sadness. I had to, Dad. It was either grow stronger or let them win. And I'm done letting anyone else control my life. As they drove back to the penthouse, Richard's mind raced with the implications of Catherine's revelations. They were on the cusp of something big, he could feel it. But with that potential victory came increased danger. Frank, Richard said into his phone, we need to increase security, not just for us, but for Catherine Holloway as well. And get the team together. We've got a lot of new information to process. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Catherine's testimony to the DA provided a treasure trove of evidence, opening up new avenues of investigation and strengthening their case immeasurably. But as news of Catherine's defection spread, the pressure from Holloway's camp intensified. Threatening phone calls, suspicious vehicles parked outside their building, thinly veiled warnings delivered through intermediaries. It was clear that Holloway was pulling out all the stops to silence them. Through it all, Emily remained steadfast. She worked tirelessly, coordinating with their legal team, reaching out to other victims and using her growing public platform to shed light on the insidious nature of emotional and financial abuse. One evening, as they sat reviewing strategy with Frank and the DA, Emily made an announcement that took everyone by surprise. I want to start a foundation, she said, her voice firm. A place where survivors of abuse can find resources, legal support, and a community of people who understand what they're going through. We can use the publicity from this case to shine a light on these issues and help people who might otherwise suffer in silence. The room fell quiet for a moment, then erupted in a chorus of supportive voices. Richard felt a surge of pride so strong it nearly overwhelmed him. This was Emily in her element, taking her pain and transforming it into a force for good in the world. As the meeting wound down and people began to leave, Richard pulled Emily aside. I'm so proud of you, sweetheart. Your mother would be too, you know. Emily's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Thanks, Dad. I hope we can make a real difference. Richard hugged her tightly. We already are, Em. Every day, with every person who finds the courage to speak out because of you, we're changing the world, one story at a time. As they stood there, father and daughter united in purpose, Richard knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The unexpected allies they had found, the strength they had discovered in themselves and each other, it was all leading to something greater than any of them had imagined. The storm might still be raging, but they had built a lighthouse, a beacon of hope for all those lost in the darkness of abuse and manipulation. And with each passing day, that light grew stronger, reaching further, illuminating the path to justice and healing for countless others. The battle was far from over, but in that moment, Richard knew with absolute certainty that they would prevail. Not just for themselves, but for every person who had ever felt trapped, silenced, or alone. They were no longer just fighting a legal battle. They were sparking a movement, a revolution of compassion and courage that would ripple out far beyond the courtroom. And at the heart of it all was Emily, his daughter, standing tall and unbroken, ready to take on the world. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and spectators as Emily Hartley made her way through the throng, her father Richard and their legal team forming a protective barrier around her. It was the first day of James Forrester's trial, and the air was thick with tension and anticipation. As they approached the entrance, a voice called out from the crowd, "Emily! Emily, we believe you!" Emily turned to see a group of women holding signs of support. Their faces were familiar, survivors she had connected with through her newly established foundation. She managed a small smile and a wave before being ushered inside. The courtroom was a sea of murmurs as they took their seats. Emily's eyes locked onto James, sitting at the defense table. He looked smaller somehow, his usual charisma dulled by the gravity of the situation. For a moment their gazes met, and Emily felt a chill run down her spine. But this time she didn't look away. She held his stare, unwavering, until he was the one to break contact. As the proceedings began, Emily leaned close to her father. "I'm nervous," she whispered. Richard squeezed her hand reassuringly. "You've got this, Em. Just tell the truth. Your truth." The prosecution's opening statement was powerful, painting a vivid picture of James's pattern of abuse and manipulation, but it was when Emily took the stand that the true impact of their case became clear. With quiet strength, Emily recounted her experiences, the whirlwind romance, the gradual isolation, the emotional manipulation and financial control. Her voice never wavered, even as she described the darkest moments of her marriage. "Mr. Forrester didn't just take my money or my freedom," Emily concluded, her eyes sweeping the courtroom. "He tried to take my sense of self, but I'm here today to reclaim it and to ensure that he can never do this to anyone else." As Emily stepped down from the witness stand, she could feel the shift in the courtroom. The jurors' faces showed a mix of sympathy and outrage. Even some members of the press who had been skeptical at first were nodding in understanding. But James's defense team was ruthless. They brought up Emily's past relationships, questioned her mental state, and even suggested that she was part of a larger conspiracy to bring down James and Victor Holloway. It was during a particularly brutal cross-examination that an unexpected voice rang out from the gallery. "Objection!" All heads turned to see Catherine Holloway standing, her face flushed with anger. The judge, startled by this interruption, called for order. "Mrs. Holloway," the judge said sternly, "you are not a lawyer and cannot object. Please be seated or I'll have you removed from the courtroom." Catherine took a deep breath. "I apologize, Your Honor, but I can't sit silently while this young woman is attacked for telling the truth. I have information relevant to this case, and I'm willing to testify." The courtroom erupted in chaos. James's lawyers immediately moved for a mistrial, while the prosecution scrambled to capitalize on this unexpected turn of events. Through it all, Emily sat quietly, her eyes fixed on Catherine, a silent understanding passing between them. As the judge called a recess to deal with this new development, Richard leaned in close to Emily. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Emily nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "I'm more than okay, Dad. For the first time, I feel like we're really being heard." The next few days were a whirlwind of testimony. Catherine Holloway took the stand, revealing the extent of her husband's involvement in James's schemes. Financial experts presented evidence of the complex web of fraud that James had woven. And, most powerfully, other survivors, James's previous wives and girlfriends, came forward to share their stories. With each testimony, each piece of evidence, Emily could see James's carefully constructed facade crumbling. The charming, successful businessman was revealed as a serial abuser and fraudster. But it wasn't until Victor Holloway himself was indicted and brought to trial that the full scope of their operation came to light. The courtroom was packed as Victor took the stand, his once imposing presence diminished by the weight of the evidence against him. As the prosecution laid out the charges, racketeering, fraud, conspiracy, Emily felt a mix of emotions. Relief that the truth was finally coming out, anger at the lives that had been damaged, and a growing sense of purpose. During a break in the proceedings, Emily overheard two young women talking in the hallway. "I never thought I'd have the courage to leave my boyfriend," one was saying. "But hearing Emily's story, seeing her stand up to these men, it gave me hope." Emily's heart swelled. This, she realized, was why they had fought so hard. Not just for justice for themselves, but for every person who had ever felt trapped or silenced. As the trial neared its conclusion, Emily's foundation was flooded with calls and messages. Survivors reaching out for help, volunteers offering their services, even lawmakers interested in strengthening laws against emotional and financial abuse. The night before the verdict was to be announced, Emily and Richard sat on the balcony of their penthouse looking out over the city. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Emily said softly, "I want you to know how grateful I am, Dad, for believing in me, for fighting alongside me." Richard pulled her into a tight hug. "Oh, Em, you're the one who did all the hard work. I'm just grateful I got my daughter back." As they sat there, the city lights twinkling below them, Emily felt a sense of peace wash over her. She thought of all the women and men who had reached out to her, all the lives that had been touched by their fight for justice. "You know," she mused, "when this all started, I thought I had lost everything. My marriage, my sense of self, my dreams for the future. But now I realize I've gained so much more. Purpose, strength, a whole community of survivors and allies. Richard nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. You've always had that strength inside you, Em. You just needed to rediscover it. As the night deepened, father and daughter sat in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The journey had been long and painful, but it had led them here, to a place of healing, of purpose, of hope. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The verdict, whatever it might be, would be just one more step in their ongoing fight for justice. But Emily knew now that she was ready to face whatever came next. She was no longer a victim, no longer defined by what had been done to her. She was a survivor, a warrior, a beacon of hope for others. And with her father by her side and a growing army of allies behind her, she felt ready to take on the world. As the first light of dawn began to paint the sky, Emily took a deep breath, feeling the promise of a new day, a new chapter, a new life stretching out before her. Whatever the future held, she would face it with courage, with strength, and with the unwavering knowledge that her voice and the voices of all survivors deserved to be heard. The tide had turned, and there was no going back. The world was changing, one story, one trial, one life at a time, and Emily Hartley was at the forefront of that change, ready to lead the way towards a future where no one would have to suffer in silence again. The morning of the verdict dawned clear and bright, a stark contrast to the tension that hung in the air. Emily stood before her mirror, smoothing down her crisp blue blazer, a symbol of the professional woman she had once been and was becoming again. Her hands trembled slightly as she fastened a small silver pin to her lapel, a gift from the survivors group she had been working with, a reminder of why she was fighting. "Ready?" Richard's voice came from the doorway, gentle and supportive as always. Emily took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "As I'll ever be." The ride to the courthouse was silent, each lost in their own thoughts. As they pulled up, Emily was once again struck by the crowd gathered on the steps. Signs of support mingled with press cameras and curious onlookers. But this time, instead of feeling overwhelmed, Emily felt a surge of strength. These people were here because her story, and the stories of countless others, had finally been heard. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Emily's eyes swept across the room, taking in the faces that had become familiar over the weeks of the trial. James and his lawyers at the defense table looking tense, the prosecuting attorney, confidence radiating from her posture. And in the gallery, a mix of supporters, press, and... was that Catherine Holloway slipping in quietly at the back? As the jury filed in, Emily reached for her father's hand, gripping it tightly. This was it, the moment they had fought so hard for. In the case of the state versus James Forrester, on the charge of aggravated emotional abuse, we find the defendant guilty. Emily's breath caught in her throat. On the charge of financial fraud, we find the defendant guilty. The litany continued, a string of guilty verdicts that seemed to release years of pent-up emotion in the courtroom. Emily felt tears streaming down her face, but for once they were tears of relief, of vindication. As the judge called for order, Emily turned to hug her father, then Frank, then Sarah Pearson, but her eyes were drawn to James. For a moment, their gazes locked, and Emily saw something she had never seen before in his eyes: defeat. The sentencing would come later, but for now this was enough. Justice had been served. Outside the courthouse, Emily faced a sea of microphones and cameras. Taking a deep breath, she stepped up to make a statement. Today, justice was served not just for me, but for every person who has ever suffered in silence at the hands of an abuser. This verdict sends a clear message. Emotional and financial abuse are real. They are harmful, and they will not be tolerated. She paused, her voice growing stronger. But our work is far from over. To every survivor out there who is still afraid, still doubting themselves, I want you to know that you are not alone. There is hope, there is help, and there is a community ready to support you. As Emily finished her statement, a cheer went up from the crowd. She felt her father's arm around her shoulders, steadying her as they made their way through the throng. But the day's surprises weren't over yet. As they reached their car, a familiar voice called out, "Emily, Mr. Hartley." They turned to see Catherine Holloway hurrying towards them, her face a mix of emotions. I just wanted to say thank you," Catherine said, her voice trembling slightly. "Your courage, your determination, it gave me the strength to stand up to Victor, to tell the truth." Emily reached out, clasping Catherine's hand in her own. "No, thank you, Mrs. Holloway. Your testimony was crucial. You're just as much a hero in this as anyone." Catherine's eyes welled with tears. "I don't feel like a hero. I feel lost. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, it's all been a lie." Emily felt a surge of compassion for this woman who had risked everything to do the right thing. "It's okay to feel lost," she said softly. "Believe me, I know. But you're not alone. We have support groups, counseling services, whatever you need, we're here." As Catherine nodded gratefully, Emily had a sudden inspiration. "In fact, we're always looking for experienced voices to help with the foundation. Someone who understands the complexities of these situations. If you're interested, of course." For the first time, a genuine smile lit up Catherine's face. I'd like that. Thank you, Emily." As they parted ways, Emily felt a sense of completion. This wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about healing, about turning pain into purpose. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The sentencing hearings for both James and Victor Holloway. Meetings with lawmakers interested in strengthening abuse prevention laws. Interviews, speaking engagements, and the ever-growing work of the foundation. Through it all, Emily found herself growing stronger, more confident. The nightmares that had plagued her for so long began to fade, replaced by dreams of the future, a future she was actively shaping. One evening, as she and Richard sat in his study reviewing plans for a new survivor support center, Emily paused, a thoughtful expression on her face. "You know, Dad, I've been thinking. Everything we've been through, everything we've learned, it feels like we're just scratching the surface. There's so much more to be done." Richard nodded, a hint of pride in his eyes. "What did you have in mind?" Emily leaned forward, her eyes bright with excitement. "I want to expand the foundation, not just support services, but education programs, teaching young people about healthy relationships, financial literacy, the warning signs of abuse, and advocacy work, really pushing for systemic changes." As she outlined her vision, Richard felt a swell of emotion. This was Emily in her element, passionate, driven, using her experiences to make the world a better place. "It sounds ambitious," he said when she finished, "and absolutely wonderful. Where do we start?" Emily grinned, pulling out a stack of papers. "I thought you'd never ask." As they dove into the plans, Emily felt a sense of peace wash over her. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, moments of doubt, but she was ready for them. She was no longer defined by what had happened to her, but by what she chose to do with it. Every life touched, every survivor empowered, every abuser held accountable. It all added up to a legacy she could be proud of. And as she worked late into the night, her father by her side, Emily knew that this purpose, this passion, this unwavering commitment to justice and healing was the truest form of redemption. The storm had passed, and in its wake, Emily Hartley stood tall, a beacon of hope and strength for all those still finding their way out of the darkness. The future stretched out before her, full of possibility and promise, and she was ready to meet it head-on. One story, one life, one victory at a time. 1 year had passed since the verdict that had changed everything. Emily Hartley stood at the podium, looking out over a sea of faces, survivors, advocates, lawmakers, and media representatives. The conference room of the newly opened Hartley Foundation for Survivor Empowerment buzzed with anticipation. "Welcome, everyone," Emily began, her voice strong and clear. "A year ago, I stood on the steps of a courthouse, having just won a battle I never thought I'd have to fight. Today I stand before you not as a victim, but as a warrior, and I see an army of warriors before me." As Emily delivered her keynote address, outlining the Foundation's achievements over the past year and its plans for the future, Richard watched from the sidelines, his heart swelling with pride. The transformation in his daughter still amazed him daily. Emily spoke of the support centers they had opened in 3 states, the hotline that had fielded thousands of calls, the educational programs implemented in dozens of schools. But more than the statistics, it was the stories that moved the audience. Stories of lives rebuilt, of survivors becoming advocates, of a society slowly but surely awakening to the realities of emotional and financial abuse. But our work is far from over, Emily continued, her voice taking on a note of determination. Today I'm excited to announce the launch of our most ambitious project yet, the Phoenix Initiative. A murmur of interest rippled through the crowd. The Phoenix Initiative will focus on long-term rehabilitation and empowerment. We're not just helping survivors escape abusive situations. We're giving them the tools to rebuild their lives. Financial literacy programs, career counseling, legal aid, and ongoing therapeutic support. We're partnering with businesses to create job opportunities, with universities to offer scholarships, and with lawmakers to push for stronger protective legislation. As Emily detailed the initiative, Richard couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought them here. The pain, the fear, the moments of despair, all transformed into this force for good. He thought of James now serving his sentence and of Victor Holloway awaiting trial. Their actions had caused so much harm, but in the end, they had unknowingly sparked a movement far more powerful than their schemes. After the presentation, as Emily moved through the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging words of encouragement, she found herself face to face with a familiar figure, Catherine Holloway. "That was inspiring, Emily," Catherine said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I never imagined, when I first reached out to you, I was so lost. And now look at all of this." Emily squeezed Catherine's hand warmly. "None of this would have been possible without your courage, Catherine. How are you doing?" Catherine's smile was tinged with sadness, but also hope. "It's been a challenging year, I won't lie. The divorce, the legal proceedings, rebuilding my life. But working with the foundation, helping other women who've been through similar experiences, it's given me purpose." As they chatted, Emily was struck by how far they had both come. Catherine, once trapped in a marriage built on lies, was now one of the Foundation's most valuable advisors, bringing insight and empathy to their programs. The conference continued late into the evening, with breakout sessions, networking opportunities, and strategy meetings. As things were winding down, Emily found a quiet moment with her father on the building's rooftop garden. "So," Richard said, handing her a cup of coffee, "how does it feel? A year ago, we were just talking about starting a small support group. Now look at all this." Emily took a sip, looking out over the city lights. "It feels right. Like this is what I was always meant to do in a way. But Dad, I couldn't have done any of this without you." Richard put an arm around her shoulders. "Oh, I think you could have, but I'm glad I got to be part of it. Your mother would be so proud of you, Em." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both lost in thought. Then Emily spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about forgiveness lately." Richard looked at her, surprised. "Oh?" Emily nodded slowly. "Not forgiving James or Victor. What they did was unforgivable. But forgiving myself, I guess. For not seeing the signs earlier, for doubting myself, and in a way forgiving life for throwing this curveball at me." She turned to face her father, her eyes bright with emotion. "Because as horrible as it was, as much as I wish it had never happened, look at all the good that's come out of it, all the lives we're touching, the changes we're making. If I hadn't gone through that, none of this would exist." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. That's an incredibly mature way of looking at it, Em. I'm not sure I'm there yet myself. Seeing what he did to you." Emily hugged him tightly. "I know, Dad, and you don't have to be. But for me, it's part of healing. Not letting the anger and pain define me anymore." As they made their way back to the conference, Emily was stopped by a young woman, barely out of her teens, clutching a copy of Emily's recently published memoir. "Miss Hartley," the girl said, her voice trembling slightly, "I just wanted to thank you, your book. It helped me realize that what my boyfriend was doing wasn't okay. I left him last month. I'm still scared, but I'm free." Emily felt tears prick her eyes as she hugged the young woman. "You're so brave," she whispered, "and you're not alone. We're here for you, every step of the way." As the girl walked away, visibly moved, Richard squeezed Emily's shoulder. "You see, that right there, that's why we do this." Emily nodded, wiping her eyes. "One life at a time. It's not always easy, but it's worth it," Richard finished. As the conference came to a close, Emily found herself filled with a sense of purpose and hope, stronger than ever before. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be setbacks, challenges, moments of doubt. But looking around at the community they had built, the lives they had touched, she knew that they were on the right path. The seeds of change had been planted, nurtured by tears and determination, and were now beginning to bloom. And Emily Hartley, once a victim, now stood tall as a leader, a warrior, and a beacon of hope for survivors everywhere. As she left the building that night, stepping out into the cool evening air, Emily took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility, but also the exhilaration of possibility. The future stretched out before her, full of challenges, but also full of promise, and she was ready to meet it head-on, armed with compassion, courage, and an unwavering commitment to justice and healing. The storm had long passed, and in its wake a movement had been born, a movement of strength, of resilience, of transformation. And at its heart stood Emily Hartley, no longer defined by her past, but by the future she was helping to create. One story, one life, one victory at a time. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of change as Emily Hartley made her way across the bustling college campus. Fallen leaves crunched underfoot, a vibrant carpet of reds and golds mirroring the transformative energy she felt all around her. Today marked the launch of the Hartley Foundation's newest initiative, a comprehensive course on healthy relationships and financial empowerment, now being offered at universities across the country. Emily, as the guest lecturer for the inaugural class, felt a mix of excitement and nervous anticipation. As she entered the lecture hall, the buzz of conversation died down, replaced by an expectant hush. Hundreds of young faces looked up at her, some curious, some admiring, some skeptical. Emily took a deep breath, remembering her own college days, how different her life might have been if she'd had access to this kind of knowledge and support. "Good morning," she began, her voice clear and strong. "I'm Emily Hartley, and I'm here to talk to you about something that isn't often discussed in academic settings, but that will impact every aspect of your lives: the dynamics of healthy relationships and financial independence." As Emily launched into her lecture, weaving personal anecdotes with hard data and practical advice, she could see the impact of her words rippling through the audience. Pens scribbled furiously in notebooks, heads nodded in recognition, and here and there she caught glimpses of tears quickly wiped away. Financial abuse, Emily explained, is often the invisible chain that keeps people trapped in toxic relationships. Understanding your own worth, both emotionally and financially, is the first step towards true independence. After the lecture, as students lined up to ask questions and share their own stories, Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was why she did what she did, to plant seeds of awareness and empowerment in young minds, hopefully sparing them the pain she had endured. One young woman lingered after the others had gone, fidgeting nervously with the strap of her backpack. "Miss Hartley," she said softly, I think I might be in a situation like you described. My boyfriend, he controls all our money, tells me I'm not good with finances. I'm scared to leave because I don't know how I'll support myself." Emily's heart went out to the girl. She gently led her to a quiet corner of the hall. "First of all, I want you to know that you're incredibly brave for recognizing the situation and speaking up. That's the hardest step. Now, let's talk about some resources and options." By the time they finished talking, the young woman stood a little straighter, hope shining in her eyes. Emily watched her walk away, feeling a mixture of sadness for what the girl was going through and pride in her courage to seek help. As Emily left the campus, her phone buzzed with a message from her father. "Great news, Em. The Phoenix Initiative just got approved for federal funding. We're going national." Emily's heart soared. The Phoenix Initiative, their program for long-term survivor support and rehabilitation, had been her passion project for the past year. This funding would allow them to reach so many more people, to make a real, lasting difference on a national scale. That evening, as Emily shared the news with her team at their weekly meeting, the energy in the room was electric. Catherine Holloway, now a key advisor for the foundation, raised her glass in a toast. "To Emily," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "who turned her pain into purpose and showed us all the true meaning of resilience." As cheers and applause filled the room, Emily felt overwhelmed with gratitude. She looked around at the faces of her team, survivors, advocates, experts in various fields, all united in their commitment to breaking the cycle of abuse and empowering others. Later that night, as Emily sat in her office reviewing plans for the initiative's expansion, a familiar voice came from the doorway. Burning the midnight oil again, Em? She looked up to see her father, Richard, leaning against the doorframe, a mixture of pride and concern on his face. Emily smiled, stretching her tired muscles. Just excited about the possibilities, Dad. With this funding, we can open support centers in every state, expand our educational programs, offer more comprehensive legal aid. Richard came in, settling into the chair across from her desk. It's amazing what you've built here. But Em, don't forget to take care of yourself too. You can't pour from an empty cup, you know. Emily nodded, recognizing the truth in her father's words. I know, Dad. It's just, sometimes I feel like there's so much more to do, so many people still suffering in silence. Richard reached across the desk, taking her hand in his. And you're making a difference every single day. But this is a marathon, not a sprint. The movement you've started, it's bigger than just you now. It'll keep going even if you take a day off now and then. As they sat there, father and daughter united in purpose, Emily felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She thought of how far they'd come, of the battles they'd fought and the victories they'd won. But more than that, she thought of the lives they'd touched, the ripples of hope spreading out from every action, every word, every small act of kindness and courage. You know, Emily said softly, sometimes I still can't believe this is my life, that something so positive could come out of such a dark time. Richard squeezed her hand. That's the thing about light, Em. It shines brightest in the darkness. And you, my dear, are a beacon. As they left the office together, walking out into the cool night air, Emily felt a sense of peace settle over her. The road ahead was long, the work never-ending. But she was no longer walking alone. She had her father, her team, and a growing community of survivors and allies, all moving forward together. The stars twinkled overhead, a reminder of the vastness of the universe and the interconnectedness of all things. Emily thought of the young woman from the lecture, of Catherine Holloway's journey from victim to advocate, of all the lives touched and changed by the ripples of their work. And in that moment, Emily Hartley knew with absolute certainty that this was exactly where she was meant to be. Not defined by her past, but inspired by it. Not limited by her experiences, but empowered by them. A warrior, a leader, a voice for the voiceless. As she and Richard walked toward their car, Emily's mind was already racing with new ideas, new projects, new ways to reach out and make a difference. The journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But with each step, with each life touched, with each small victory, they were creating a future brighter than any they could have imagined. The night was full of possibility, and Emily Hartley was ready to greet the dawn, knowing that with each new day came new opportunities to spread hope, to foster change, and to prove that even the deepest wounds could become wellsprings of strength and compassion. The early morning sun cast long shadows across Emily Hartley's desk as she sifted through her emails, her brow furrowed in concentration. The Hartley Foundation had grown exponentially over the past 2 years, and with that growth came new challenges and responsibilities. A knock on her office door broke her focus. "Come in," she called, looking up to see her assistant Jake enter with a concerned expression. "Emily, there's something you need to see," he said, handing her a tablet with a news article pulled up. As Emily read, her face paled. The headline blared, "James Forrester to be released on parole." For a moment, Emily felt as if the ground had dropped out from beneath her. James, the man who had systematically abused and manipulated her, was going to be free. All the old fears and anxieties she thought she'd conquered came rushing back in a tidal wave of emotion. "Are you okay?" Jake asked gently. "Should I call your father?" Emily took a deep breath, steadying herself. "No, I'll be fine. Can you clear my schedule for the morning? I need some time to process this." As Jake left, closing the door behind him, Emily leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She had known this day would come eventually, but she hadn't expected it so soon. The article mentioned good behavior and overcrowding as reasons for the early release. With shaking hands, Emily picked up her phone and dialed a familiar number. "Frank? It's Emily. I need your help." Frank Blackwood, the private investigator who had been instrumental in building the case against James, listened patiently as Emily explained the situation. "I understand your concerns, Emily," he said when she finished. "I'll look into the conditions of his release and make sure all the proper protocols are in place. And I'll arrange for some discreet security for you, just in case." Emily thanked him, feeling a small measure of relief. But as she hung up, she couldn't shake the unease that had settled over her. She had worked so hard to rebuild her life, to transform her pain into something positive. Would James's release threaten all of that? A soft knock on her door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. She looked up to see her father standing there, concern etched on his face. "Jake called me," Richard said, crossing the room to embrace his daughter. "How are you holding up, Em?" Emily leaned into her father's comforting presence, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability. "I'm scared, Dad," she admitted. "Not just for myself, but for all the women we've helped. What if he tries to retaliate? What if—" Richard gently cut her off. "Emily, look at me. You are not the same woman you were when James had power over you. You're stronger now, wiser, and you're not alone. We've built a community, a support system. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." As Emily nodded, wiping away a stray tear, her phone buzzed with a text. It was from Catherine Holloway. "Just heard the news. Meeting at my place tonight. Bringing the whole team. We've got your back, Emily." A small smile tugged at Emily's lips as she showed the message to her father. "See," Richard said, "you've got an army behind you now." That evening, Emily found herself surrounded by her closest allies in Catherine's cozy living room. Frank was there, along with Sarah Pearson, the DA who had prosecuted James. Several key members of the Foundation's staff had also come, as well as representatives from partner organizations. As they discussed strategies and safety measures, Emily felt her fear gradually being replaced by determination. Yes, James's release was a setback, but it was also an opportunity, a chance to show that they were stronger than the shadows of their past. "We need to get ahead of this," Sarah Pearson was saying. "Make a public statement, remind people of the importance of the work we're doing." Catherine nodded in agreement. "And we should reach out to the survivors in our network, especially those who might be triggered by this news. Let them know we're here for them." As the night wore on and plans were made, Emily found herself stepping out onto Catherine's balcony, needing a moment of quiet. The city stretched out before her, a tapestry of lights against the dark sky. She felt, rather than heard, her father join her. "Penny, for your thoughts?" he asked softly. Emily took a deep breath of the cool night air. "I was just thinking, 2 years ago, news like this would have destroyed me. I would have felt helpless, alone, but now you have an entire community ready to stand with you," Richard finished. Emily nodded, a determined glint in her eye. "More than that, Dad. Now I have the power to turn this into something positive. To use it as a reminder of why our work is so important, why we can never stop fighting." Richard put an arm around her shoulders, pride evident in his voice. "That's my girl. So, what's the plan?" Emily turned to face him, her mind already racing with ideas. "We're going to use this as a rallying cry. A campaign to strengthen parole conditions for abusers, to improve support systems for survivors post-trial. And we're going to tell our story, not just mine, but all of ours, louder than ever." As they rejoined the group inside, Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose. Yes, the shadows of the past still lingered, but they no longer had the power to eclipse the light she and her allies had worked so hard to cultivate. In the days that followed, Emily threw herself into action. Press conferences were held, opinion pieces were written, and a new initiative was launched to address the gaps in the justice system that allowed for early releases like James's. The Foundation's hotline was busier than ever, with survivors reaching out for support and allies offering to help. Emily made sure to personally speak with as many callers as she could, drawing strength from their stories of resilience and courage. One evening, as Emily was preparing to leave the office after another long day, she received an unexpected visitor. It was Sarah Thompson, James's first wife, whom Emily had met during the trial. "I heard about James," Sarah said, her voice quiet but steady. "I wanted to see how you were doing, and to thank you." Emily ushered her in, curious. "Thank me? For what?" Sarah's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "For giving me the courage to finally tell my story. For showing me that it's possible to not just survive, but to thrive. Seeing how you've turned your pain into this amazing foundation, it inspired me to start counseling other survivors in my community." As they talked, sharing experiences and hopes for the future, Emily felt a profound sense of connection. This was the true power of the work they were doing, not just helping individuals, but creating a network of support and empowerment that stretched far beyond the Foundation's official reach. Later that night, as Emily finally headed home, she felt a lightness in her step that had been missing since the news of James's release broke. The shadows of the past would always be there, she realized, but they didn't have to define the future. With each life touched, each story shared, each small victory won, they were creating a legacy of hope and resilience. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, Emily knew that she and the community she had helped build were ready to face them head-on. As she looked up at the starry sky, Emily whispered a quiet thank you to the universe for the strength she had found, for the purpose she had discovered, and for the countless lives that had become intertwined with her own on this journey of healing and transformation. The road ahead might be uncertain, but Emily Hartley was no longer afraid of the shadows. She was too busy shining her own light, illuminating the path for others to follow, and proving that even the deepest wounds could become sources of immeasurable strength and compassion. The auditorium was packed to capacity, a sea of faces both young and old, all turned expectantly towards the stage. Emily Hartley stood in the wings, taking deep breaths to calm her nerves. This wasn't her first public speaking engagement, far from it, but today felt different. Today she was about to share the stage with someone she never thought she'd face again. As the moderator introduced the panel, Emily stepped out into the bright lights, smiling and waving to the audience. She took her seat, and then from the opposite side of the stage, he appeared. James Forrester. A hush fell over the crowd as James made his way to his chair. He looked older, thinner, the confident swagger of his past self notably absent. As he sat down, his eyes met Emily's for a brief moment, and she saw something there she hadn't expected: remorse. The moderator, a respected journalist, began the session. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for this unprecedented dialogue. Today we have with us Emily Hartley, founder of the Hartley Foundation for Survivor Empowerment, and James Forrester, recently released from prison. They're here to discuss the long-term impacts of emotional and financial abuse, the possibility of rehabilitation, and the path forward for both survivors and offenders. As the discussion began, Emily found herself speaking with a calm and clarity that surprised even her. She talked about her experiences, the work of the foundation, and the systemic changes needed to prevent abuse and support survivors. When it was James's turn to speak, his voice was low and halting. I want to start by saying that I'm deeply sorry for the pain I've caused, not just to Emily, but to all the women I've hurt over the years. My time in prison forced me to confront the person I was, the damage I've done. I know that sorry isn't enough, that it can never undo what I've done. But I'm committed to changing, to using my experiences to help prevent others from going down the same path. As the panel continued, Emily found herself engaged in a surreal but productive dialogue with the man who had once controlled every aspect of her life. They discussed the roots of abusive behavior, the importance of early intervention and education, and the need for comprehensive support systems for both survivors and reformed offenders. The audience listened in rapt attention, many taking notes, others nodding in understanding or wiping away tears. This wasn't just a discussion, it was a breakthrough, a bridge being built between two sides of a painful divide. Towards the end of the session, a young man in the audience stood up to ask a question. Mr. Forrester, given your past, why should anyone believe that you've really changed? How can you prove that this isn't just another manipulation? James nodded, acknowledging the validity of the question. You're right to be skeptical, he said. Words alone aren't enough. That's why, since my release, I've been working with a rehabilitative program for offenders. I'm not asking for forgiveness or trust. I'm simply committed to doing the work day by day, to become a better person, and to help prevent others from making the same terrible choices I did. As the panel concluded, Emily felt a complex mix of emotions. There was still anger and pain, yes, but also a glimmer of something else. Hope, perhaps. Not for reconciliation. Some bridges once burned can never be rebuilt, but for a future where cycles of abuse could be broken before they began. After the event, as Emily was gathering her things, she felt a presence behind her. She turned to find James standing there a respectful distance away. Emily, he said softly, I know I have no right to speak to you, but I wanted to thank you for agreeing to this panel and to tell you how incredibly sorry I am. The work you're doing, It's amazing. You've turned what I did to you into something powerful and positive. I know it doesn't change the past, but I want you to know that I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make amends." Emily looked at him for a long moment, seeing not the charming, manipulative man she had married, but a broken individual struggling to find redemption. "James," she replied, her voice steady, "I can't forgive you. Not now, maybe not ever. But I appreciate your willingness to be part of this dialogue. If you're serious about change, about prevention, then keep doing the work. Not for me, but for all the potential victims out there who might be spared because of education and intervention." James nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I understand. Thank you, Emily." "For everything." As James walked away, Emily felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had faced her abuser not from a place of fear or victimhood, but from a position of strength and purpose. Later that evening, as Emily recounted the events of the day to her father over dinner, Richard listened with a mix of concern and pride. "How you continue to amaze me, Em," he said, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "Are you okay, though? Seeing him again, talking to him, it must have been incredibly difficult." Emily took a sip of her wine, considering the question. "It was hard," she admitted. "There was a moment when I saw him and all the old fear came rushing back. But then I remembered who I am now, what I've built, and I realized that he no longer has any power over me." She paused, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. "You know, Dad, today made me realize something. The work we're doing with the foundation, it's not just about helping survivors. It's about breaking the cycle completely. And that means finding ways to rehabilitate offenders, to educate young people before abusive patterns set in." Richard nodded, a proud smile on his face. "That's a big undertaking, Em. But if anyone can do it, it's you." As the night wore on, Emily's mind raced with new ideas and possibilities. The panel had opened up avenues she hadn't considered before. Perhaps there was a way to collaborate with rehabilitative programs to create a more holistic approach to abuse prevention and recovery. The next morning, Emily called an emergency meeting with her team at the foundation. As she shared her experiences from the panel and her new insights, she could see the excitement building in her colleagues' eyes. "This could be groundbreaking," Catherine Holloway said, her voice filled with enthusiasm. "A truly comprehensive approach to breaking the cycle of abuse." As they brainstormed and planned, Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose. Yes, facing James had been difficult, but it had also shown her that there were still frontiers to explore in their work, still bridges to be built and understandings to be fostered. The path ahead would not be easy. There would be skeptics, detractors, and challenges aplenty. But Emily Hartley was no stranger to adversity. She had turned her deepest pain into her greatest strength, and she was ready to take this next step in her journey. As the meeting concluded and her team dispersed, energized and motivated, Emily stood by the window of her office, looking out at the city below. She thought of all the lives intertwined with hers, all the stories yet to be told, all the change yet to be made. With a small smile, she turned back to her desk, ready to get to work. The future was unwritten, full of possibility, and Emily was determined to fill its pages with hope, healing, and transformative change. The bridges of understanding they were building might be fragile, might require constant maintenance and care. But with each small step, each difficult conversation, each mind opened and life touched, they were creating a future where the cycles of the past no longer dictated the stories of tomorrow. And for Emily Hartley, that was a future worth fighting for. One day, one life, one bridge at a time. The soft glow of dawn was just beginning to paint the sky as Emily Hartley stood at the podium, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Before her stretched a sea of faces, survivors, advocates, lawmakers, and media representatives from across the country. This was the opening of the first National Summit on Abuse Prevention and Survivor Empowerment, a landmark event that Emily and her team had spent months organizing. "Welcome," Emily began, her voice strong and clear. "5 years ago, I stood in a courtroom, reclaiming my voice after years of abuse. Today, I stand before you not as a victim, but as a leader in a movement that is changing lives and reshaping our society's approach to abuse prevention and survivor support." As Emily delivered her keynote address, outlining the summit's ambitious goals and the Hartley Foundation's new initiatives, she couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The pain, the struggles, the victories, both small and large, all had led to this. Our work is no longer just about helping survivors escape and heal, Emily continued. It's about breaking the cycle completely. It's about education, prevention, rehabilitation, and systemic change. And it's about time we addressed all aspects of this complex issue. In the front row, Richard Hartley watched his daughter with pride swelling in his chest. Emily had come so far, transforming her personal tragedy into a force for positive change on a scale neither of them could have imagined. As the day progressed, Emily found herself constantly on the move, moderating panel discussions, networking with potential partners, and giving interviews to eager journalists. The energy at the summit was palpable, a sense of hope and determination permeating every conversation. During a brief break, Emily slipped into a quiet corner, needing a moment to catch her breath. She was surprised to find Catherine Holloway already there, looking out a window at the bustling city below. "Quite a turnout," Catherine said, smiling warmly at Emily. "You've really started something big here, you know." Emily joined her at the window. "We've started something big," she corrected gently. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Catherine." "Without all of you?" Catherine's eyes misted over. "You know, when I first reached out to you and your father all those years ago, I was terrified. I thought my life was over, but look at us now." The two women shared a moment of understanding, both marveling at how far they had come. Their conversation was interrupted by Emily's assistant, Jake, looking flustered. "Emily, I'm so sorry to bother you, but there's a situation," he said, his voice low. "A group of protesters has gathered outside. They're saying our new rehabilitation programs are too soft on abusers." Emily and Catherine exchanged a look. This was a criticism they had anticipated, but it still stung. "I'll handle it," Emily said, straightening her jacket. "Catherine, can you take over the next panel for me?" As Emily made her way to the entrance, she could hear the chants of the protesters growing louder. Taking a deep breath, she stepped outside to face them. The crowd fell silent as Emily approached the makeshift podium that had been set up. She looked out at the sea of angry faces, understanding their pain and fear all too well. "I hear you," she began, her voice carrying across the plaza. "I understand your anger, your concern. I've lived it. But I'm here to tell you that the path to true change, to breaking the cycle of abuse once and for all, isn't through punishment alone." As Emily spoke, sharing her own story and the complex realities of abuse and rehabilitation, she could see the mood of the crowd slowly shifting. Not everyone was convinced, but seeds of understanding were being planted. "We're not excusing abusive behavior," Emily concluded. "We're working to prevent it from happening in the first place. And for those who have caused harm and truly want to change, we're providing a path to redemption that benefits all of society. Because every abuser we rehabilitate is countless potential victims saved." As she finished speaking, a tentative applause broke out. It wasn't universal, but it was a start. Emily invited the protest leaders to join the summit, to be part of the conversation rather than standing against it. Back inside, Emily was met by her father. "I saw what happened out there," Richard said, pulling her into a hug. "You handled it beautifully, Em." Emily leaned into her father's embrace, feeling a wave of emotion wash over her. "It's not always easy, Dad. Sometimes I wonder if we're doing the right thing, if we're making a real difference." Richard pulled back, looking his daughter in the eye. "Emily, look around you. This summit, the foundation, all the lives you've touched, you're not just making a difference, you're changing the world." As they rejoined the summit, Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose. The day continued with passionate discussions, groundbreaking proposals, and moments of profound connection between survivors and advocates from all walks of life. That evening, as the first day of the summit drew to a close, Emily found herself back at the podium, addressing the assembled crowd one last time. "Today, we've taken a significant step forward in our fight against abuse in all its forms," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "But our work is far from over. As we leave here tonight, let us carry with us the stories we've heard, the connections we've made, and the hope we've kindled." She paused, looking out at the faces before her. Some tear-streaked, some determined, all united in purpose. "Because that hope," Emily continued, her voice growing stronger, "that unwavering belief in the possibility of change, of healing, of a world free from the shadows of abuse, that is our most powerful weapon. It's what drives us forward. What gives us the strength to face each new challenge? As Emily concluded her speech, the room erupted in a standing ovation. The applause washed over her, not just a celebration of her words, but a collective affirmation of the movement they were all part of. Later that night, as Emily stood on the balcony of her hotel room, looking out at the city lights, she felt a profound sense of peace. The road ahead was still long, the challenges numerous, but she was no longer walking alone. She thought of all the lives intertwined with hers now, survivors finding their voice, advocates fighting for change, even former abusers working to reform. Each story, each connection, was a thread in the tapestry of transformation they were weaving together. As the cool night air brushed her face, Emily smiled to herself. She had come so far from that broken woman scrubbing floors in a desperate attempt to please an abusive husband. But more importantly, she had helped countless others find their own path to healing and empowerment. The echoes of her story, of her work, were rippling out far beyond what she could see or measure. And in that moment, Emily Hartley knew that this endless striving for a better world, this commitment to turning pain into purpose, this was her true calling. With renewed determination, she turned back to her laptop, already planning the next steps, the next initiative, the next life to be touched. The summit was just the beginning. The real work, the daily grind of changing hearts and minds, of supporting survivors and preventing future abuse, that was ongoing. But Emily was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, ready to keep building bridges, ready to keep shining a light into the darkness. Because with each life touched, each mind opened, each cycle broken, they were creating a future brighter than any they had dared to imagine. And that future was worth every struggle, every setback, every moment of doubt. For in the end, it was not just about Emily Hartley or the Hartley Foundation. It was about creating a world where everyone could live free from fear, where love did not come with conditions, and where the echoes of empowerment drowned out the whispers of abuse once and for all. The gentle hum of conversation filled the air as Emily Hartley made her way through the crowded ballroom. The annual Hartley Foundation Gala was in full swing, a glittering affair that brought together survivors, advocates, donors, and policymakers from across the country. As she navigated the sea of elegant gowns and tailored suits, Emily couldn't help but marvel at how far they had come. 6 years had passed since that fateful day when she had found the courage to leave James and reclaim her life. Now at 34, Emily stood at the helm of one of the most influential non-profit organizations in the country, a beacon of hope for survivors of abuse and a driving force for systemic change. "Emily!" a familiar voice called out. She turned to see Sarah Thompson, James's first wife, and now a valued member of the Foundation's advisory board, approaching with a bright smile. "The turnout this year is incredible. Have you seen the latest numbers?" Emily shook her head, intrigued. Sarah's eyes sparkled with excitement as she pulled out her tablet. "We've just crossed the $1 million mark in donations, and the night's not even half over." A wave of emotion washed over Emily. $1 million meant more shelters, more education programs, more lives changed. That's amazing, Sarah. Thank you for everything you've done to make this possible." As Sarah moved on to greet other guests, Emily found herself reminiscing about the journey that had led them here. The struggles, the victories, the moments of doubt and triumph, all had shaped the foundation into what it was today. Her reverie was interrupted by a tap on her shoulder. She turned to find her father, Richard, standing there with Catherine Holloway. "Em," Richard said, his voice tinged with excitement, "Catherine has some news I think you'll want to hear." Catherine, elegant as always in a deep purple gown, leaned in close. "I've just gotten word from my contacts in Washington, the Survivor Empowerment Act we've been pushing for. It's going to be brought to the floor for a vote next month." Emily's heart leapt. The Survivor Empowerment Act was a comprehensive piece of legislation they had been working on for years. If passed, it would revolutionize the way the legal system handled cases of emotional and financial abuse, providing stronger protections for survivors and harsher penalties for abusers. "Catherine, that's incredible news," Emily exclaimed, pulling the older woman into a hug. "We need to start mobilizing our supporters right away. Can you set up a meeting with the team first thing Monday morning?" As Catherine nodded and hurried off to make arrangements, Emily felt a familiar hand on her back. She turned to see Jake, her assistant and now the foundation's head of operations, looking slightly flustered. "Emily, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a situation that needs your attention," he said, his voice low. "Remember that rehabilitation program we started last year? Well, one of the participants, it's James, he's here." Emily felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. James? Here? She had known he was participating in one of their programs. It had been a controversial decision that had caused no small amount of debate within the organization, but she hadn't expected to see him, especially not tonight. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Emily nodded to Jake. "Where is he?" Jake led her to a quiet corner of the ballroom where James stood, looking uncomfortable in a simple dark suit. As their eyes met, Emily was struck by how different he looked. Older, yes, but also humbler, the arrogance that had once defined him now notably absent. "Emily," James said softly as she approached, I'm sorry for intruding. I know I shouldn't be here, I wanted to thank you. The program, it's changed my life, made me confront who I was, who I want to be." Emily studied him for a long moment, a whirlwind of emotions coursing through her, anger, fear, pity, but also, surprisingly, a sense of validation. This, after all, was why they had started the rehabilitation programs in the first place. "James," she finally said, her voice steady, "I appreciate you coming to say this, but you're right, you shouldn't be here. This event is for survivors, for people working to make a difference. You're on a journey, and I hope it's sincere. But that journey isn't over, and your presence here could be very triggering for many of our guests." James nodded, looking ashamed. "You're right, of course. I'll leave right away. I wanted you to know that the work you're doing, it's not just helping survivors. It's helping people like me break the cycle too. Thank you, Emily, for everything." As James turned to go, Emily felt a hand on her shoulder. She looked up to see her father standing there, a mixture of concern and pride on his face. "You okay, Em?" Richard asked softly. Emily took a deep breath, surprised to find that she actually was. "Yeah, Dad, I am. You know, seeing him like that, it just reinforces why we're doing all of this. It's not just about helping survivors heal, it's about changing the whole system, breaking the cycle at every level." Richard pulled her into a hug. "You continue to amaze me, sweetheart. Your mother would be so proud of you." As they rejoined the gala, Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose. The encounter with James, brief as it was, had reminded her of how far they had come and how much further they still had to go. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of speeches, toasts, and heartfelt conversations. As Emily took to the stage to deliver her closing remarks, she looked out over the sea of faces. Survivors, allies, and advocates, all united in their commitment to creating a better world. "6 years ago," she began, her voice strong and clear, "I stood in a courtroom reclaiming my voice after years of abuse. Today I stand before you not as a victim, but as a leader in a movement that is changing lives and reshaping our society." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the room. "But my story is just one of many. Each of you here tonight has your own story, your own reason for joining this fight. And it's those stories, those reasons, that give our movement its power." As Emily continued outlining their achievements and their plans for the future, she felt a surge of emotion. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every life touched, every cycle broken, every future reclaimed. "The winds of change are blowing," she concluded, her voice filled with passion. "And together we are that wind. We are the force that will reshape our world, that will create a future where no one has to live in fear, where everyone has the power to write their own story." As applause filled the room, Emily felt a sense of peace wash over her. The road ahead was still long, the challenges numerous, but looking out at the faces before her, determined, hopeful, united, she knew that they were equal to the task. For in the end, it wasn't just about Emily Hartley or the Hartley Foundation. It was about a movement, a revolution of compassion and courage that was changing the world one life, one law, one heart at a time. And as Emily stepped down from the stage, ready to greet the next challenge, the next opportunity to make a difference, she knew that this endless striving for a better world, this commitment to turning pain into purpose, this was not just her calling, but her legacy. The winds of change were indeed blowing, and Emily Hartley was proud to be at the forefront, helping to chart the course toward a brighter, more empowered future for all. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Emily Hartley's office, casting a warm glow over the awards and accolades that lined the walls. At 35, Emily had become a nationally recognized figure in the fight against abuse and for survivor empowerment. But today, her mind was far from the praise and recognition. Instead, she found herself lost in thought, staring at a small framed photo on her desk. The picture showed a younger Emily, smiling broadly, her arms around a group of women. It was taken at the opening of their first survivor support center, nearly 7 years ago. So much had changed since then, yet the core of their mission remained the same. A knock on the door jolted Emily from her reverie. "Come in," she called, straightening up in her chair. Catherine Holloway entered, a tablet in hand and a look of excitement on her face. "Emily, I've got great news. The Survivor Empowerment Act passed. It's going to be signed into law next week." Emily's heart soared. This was the culmination of years of hard work, lobbying, and grassroots organizing. The act would provide unprecedented protections and support for survivors of all forms of abuse. "Catherine, that's incredible. We need to celebrate, to thank everyone who made this possible." As they began to plan a press conference and celebration, Emily's phone buzzed with a text from her father. "Proud of you, Em. Mom would be too. Dinner tonight to celebrate?" Emily smiled, feeling a wave of emotion wash over her. Her father had been her rock through everything, and his unwavering support had meant the world to her. Just then, Jake burst into the office, slightly out of breath. "Emily, you need to see this," he said, turning on the office TV. The screen flickered to life, showing a live news broadcast. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the figure being led away in handcuffs, Victor Holloway. The news anchor's voice filled the room. In a shocking turn of events, business mogul Victor Holloway has been arrested on charges of racketeering, fraud, and conspiracy. Sources say the arrest is the result of a years-long investigation, with key evidence provided by Holloway's ex-wife, Catherine. Emily turned to Catherine, who stood watching the broadcast with a mixture of sadness and relief on her face. "Catherine, I had no idea." Catherine nodded, her eyes never leaving the screen. "It was time," she said softly. "After everything we've accomplished, I couldn't let him continue to hurt people. It wasn't easy, but it was right." As the implications of this news sank in, Emily felt a strange sense of things coming full circle. Victor Holloway, the man who had orchestrated so much pain, who had been the shadowy figure behind James's manipulations, was finally facing justice. The rest of the day passed in a blur of phone calls, meetings, and press statements. By the time Emily left the office, the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. She met her father at their favorite restaurant, a small Italian place they had been going to since she was a child. As they settled into their usual booth, Richard raised his glass in a toast. "To my incredible daughter," he said, his eyes shining with pride, "who took the worst moment of her life and turned it into a force for good that's changing the world." Emily clinked her glass against his, feeling a lump form in her throat. "I couldn't have done any of it without you, Dad." As they enjoyed their meal, Emily found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. From the terrified woman scrubbing floors to please an abusive husband, to the leader of a national movement, it seemed almost unreal. "You know, Dad," she said, twirling pasta around her fork, "sometimes I still can't believe how much has changed, not just for me, but for so many others. The stories I hear every day, the lives we're touching, it's overwhelming sometimes." Richard reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "That's the thing about pain, Em. When you find a way to transform it, to use it to help others, it becomes something powerful. You've created a legacy that will outlive us all." As they left the restaurant, Emily's phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from James. Her finger hovered over the delete button for a moment, before curiosity got the better of her. She opened it. "Emily, I heard about the Survivor Empowerment Act passing. I know my words don't mean much, but I wanted to say congratulations. What you've built, the lives you're changing, it's incredible. I'm continuing my work in the rehabilitation program, trying to make amends in whatever way I can. I know it doesn't erase the past, but I hope it helps prevent others from making the same terrible mistakes I did. Thank you for showing me that change is possible." Emily stared at the screen for a long moment, a complex mix of emotions washing over her. She didn't reply. Some bridges, once burned, could never be fully rebuilt, but the email served as a powerful reminder of how far they had all come. Later that night, as Emily stood on the balcony of her apartment, looking out over the city lights, she felt a profound sense of peace. The journey had been long and often painful, but it had led her to this moment, to a place where she could truly make a difference. She thought of all the lives intertwined with hers now, survivors finding their strength, advocates fighting for change, even former abusers working to reform. Each story, each connection, was a thread in the tapestry of transformation they were weaving together. The Survivor Empowerment Act, Victor Holloway's arrest, James's ongoing rehabilitation, they were all part of a larger shift, a changing tide in how society viewed and addressed abuse. And Emily Hartley was at the forefront, helping to guide that change. As she turned to go back inside, Emily caught sight of her reflection in the window. She saw not just herself, but echoes of every survivor she had met, every story she had heard. She saw the strength that comes from overcoming, the wisdom born of pain, and the fierce determination to create a better world. In that moment, Emily knew that while her personal journey of healing might have come full circle, the larger journey, the fight for a world free from abuse, where every person could live with dignity and self-determination, was far from over. But she was ready. Ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, ready to keep building bridges, ready to keep shining a light into the darkness. Because with each life touched, each mind opened, each cycle broken, they were creating a future brighter than any they had dared to imagine. And as the city hummed with life below her, Emily Hartley smiled, ready to greet the dawn of a new day, a new challenge, a new opportunity to change the world. For in the end, it wasn't just about coming full circle. It was about spiraling upward, ever higher, towards a future where everyone could find their voice, reclaim their power, and write their own story of triumph and transformation. The conference room buzzed with anticipation as Emily Hartley took her seat at the head of the table. Around her sat the core team of the Hartley Foundation, each face a testament to the journey they had all undertaken together. "All right, everyone," Emily began, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of a leader who had weathered many storms. "We've achieved incredible things over the past few years, but we can't rest on our laurels. The Survivor Empowerment Act is law, but now comes the hard part: implementation and expansion." Catherine Holloway, her silver hair gleaming in the morning light, leaned forward. "I've been in touch with lawmakers in 3 more states who are interested in adopting similar legislation. We could be looking at a nationwide rollout within the next 2 years." Emily nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "That's excellent news, Catherine. Jake, how are we looking on the education front?" Jake, now the Foundation's Director of Outreach, pulled up a series of graphs on the large screen. "Our school program has been a massive success. We're now in over 500 high schools across the country, teaching students about healthy relationships and financial independence. The feedback has been overwhelmingly positive." As the meeting continued, Emily felt a familiar surge of pride and determination. They had come so far, touched so many lives, but there was still so much to do. Suddenly, Sarah Thompson, who had been quietly taking notes, spoke up. "Emily, I think it's time we considered going international." A hush fell over the room. Emily leaned back in her chair, considering. "International? That's a big step, Sarah. What did you have in mind?" Sarah's eyes shone with excitement as she outlined her vision, partnering with NGOs in developing countries, adapting their programs to different cultural contexts, creating a global network of survivor support and empowerment. As the team delved into a spirited discussion about the possibilities and challenges of international expansion, Emily found herself thinking back to where it all began, from a small support group to a national movement, and now, potentially a global force for change. The meeting ran long into the afternoon, ideas flying back and forth, plans taking shape. By the time they adjourned, Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose and excitement. As she packed up her things, Catherine approached her desk. "Emily, do you have a moment?" Emily nodded, noticing the serious look on Catherine's face. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Catherine took a deep breath. "I've been thinking, with Victor's trial coming up, I'm going to be in the spotlight again. I want to use that attention to further our cause. I'm considering writing a book, sharing my story in full for the first time. Emily reached out, squeezing Catherine's hand. Catherine, that's incredibly brave. Are you sure you're ready for that level of exposure? Catherine nodded, a determined glint in her eye. I am. It's time, and I was hoping you might consider writing the foreword. Emotion welled up in Emily's throat. I'd be honored, she said softly. As Catherine left, Emily found herself reflecting on the intricate web of relationships and experiences that had brought them all to this point. Each person on her team, each survivor they had helped, each challenge they had faced, all were threads in the tapestry of their shared mission. Later that evening, as Emily recounted the day's events to her father over dinner, Richard listened with a mixture of pride and amazement. International expansion, Em? That's incredible. Your mother would be over the moon. Emily smiled, feeling the familiar pang of missing her mother. I wish she could see it all, Dad. Sometimes I wonder what she'd think of everything we've accomplished. Richard reached across the table, taking his daughter's hand. She sees it, Em, I'm sure of it, and she's as proud as I am. As they finished their meal, Emily's phone buzzed with a news alert. She glanced at it, her eyes widening. Dad, look at this. The headline read, Tech giant announces partnership with Hartley Foundation to develop AI-driven abuse detection and prevention tools. Richard let out a low whistle. Now that's something. AI for abuse prevention? How did this come about? Emily grinned, excitement building in her voice. We've been in talks for months, but I didn't want to say anything until it was finalized. Dad, this could be game-changing. Imagine being able to detect patterns of abusive behavior in online communications, to intervene before things escalate. As they discussed the possibilities and potential challenges of this new venture, Emily felt that familiar spark of innovation and hope. They were entering uncharted territory, pushing the boundaries of what was possible in the fight against abuse. Later that night, as Emily stood on her balcony looking out over the city, she felt a sense of anticipation for what lay ahead. The Hartley Foundation was evolving, growing in ways she never could have imagined when she first started this journey. International expansion, cutting-edge technology, new partnerships and challenges. The horizon was wide open, full of possibility. And while the path forward might be uncertain, Emily knew one thing for sure. They would face it together, with the same determination and compassion that had brought them this far. As she turned to go back inside, Emily caught sight of her reflection in the window. She saw not just herself, but echoes of every person who had been part of this journey. Survivors, advocates, allies. She saw the strength of a movement that had started with one voice and had grown into a chorus of change. With a smile, Emily Hartley stepped back into her apartment, ready to embrace the new chapter that was unfolding. The work was far from over, but with each new horizon they reached, they were one step closer to a world where everyone could live free from abuse, empowered to write their own stories of triumph and transformation. The future was calling, and Emily and her team were ready to answer, carrying with them the lessons of the past, the strength of the present, and the hope of a brighter tomorrow. The sun was setting over the city as Emily Hartley stood at the podium, looking out over a sea of faces. It was the 10th anniversary gala of the Hartley Foundation, and the grand ballroom was packed with survivors, advocates, donors, and policymakers from around the world. 10 years ago, Emily began, her voice strong and clear. I stood in a courtroom, reclaiming my voice after years of abuse. Today I stand before you not just as a survivor, but as part of a global movement that is changing lives and reshaping our world's approach to abuse prevention and survivor empowerment. As Emily spoke, highlighting the Foundation's achievements over the past decade, she couldn't help but marvel at how far they had come. From a small support group to an international organization with offices in 15 countries, from local outreach programs to partnerships with tech giants and governments worldwide. But our work is far from over, Emily continued, her passion evident in every word. As we celebrate our achievements, we must also recognize the challenges that lie ahead. Abuse knows no borders, no cultural boundaries. It adapts and evolves, finding new ways to exert control and cause harm. But so do we. We evolve, we innovate, we persevere. She went on to outline their plans for the future, expanding their AI-driven prevention tools, launching a global education initiative, and pushing for international laws to protect survivors and hold abusers accountable. As Emily concluded her speech, her eyes found her father in the audience. Richard Hartley, now in his 70s but still sharp as ever, beamed with pride. Beside him sat Catherine Holloway, whose book had become a bestseller and a powerful tool in their advocacy work. The applause was thunderous as Emily stepped down from the stage. As she made her way through the crowd, accepting congratulations and words of gratitude, she was struck by the diversity of the attendees. People from all walks of life, all corners of the globe, united in their commitment to creating a world free from abuse. Later in the evening, as the gala was winding down, Emily found a quiet moment with her core team. Catherine, Jake, Sarah, and several others who had been with her from the early days. "I can't believe it's been 10 years, Sarah mused, a hint of wonder in her voice. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday that we were just starting out." Jake nodded, raising his glass. "And look at us now. Who would have thought our little foundation would turn into all this?" As they reminisced about the challenges they'd faced and the victories they'd won, Emily felt a wave of emotion wash over her. These people weren't just colleagues. They were family, bound together by a shared mission and years of working side by side to make a difference. Suddenly, Catherine's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, her eyes widening. "Emily, you need to see this." She handed over the phone and Emily read the message with growing amazement. It was from the Nobel Committee. The Hartley Foundation had been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for their groundbreaking work in abuse prevention and survivor empowerment. For a moment, the group stood in stunned silence. Then, slowly, smiles began to spread across their faces. It wasn't about the recognition, not really. It was about the validation of their work, the acknowledgement that what they were doing was making a real, tangible difference in the world. As the news spread through the gala, there was a renewed burst of energy and excitement. But for Emily, it was a moment of quiet reflection. She slipped away from the crowd, finding her way to a small balcony overlooking the city. The cool night air was a welcome respite as Emily leaned against the railing, looking out at the twinkling lights below. Each light represented a life, a story. How many of those stories had they touched? How many more could they reach? She felt, rather than heard, her father join her on the balcony. "Quite a night, huh?" Richard said softly, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Emily leaned into him, feeling for a moment like that scared young woman who had shown up on his doorstep all those years ago. "It's overwhelming sometimes, Dad. The responsibility, the expectations." Richard nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I know, sweetheart, but you're not alone in this. You never have been." As they stood there, father and daughter united in purpose, Emily's mind wandered back over the journey that had brought them here. The pain, the struggles, the moments of doubt and triumph. Every step, every decision, every life touched had led to this moment. But it wasn't an ending. Far from it. It was a milestone, a marker on a road that stretched far into the future. There was still so much to do, so many lives to touch, so many changes to make. As they turned to go back inside, Emily caught sight of their reflections in the glass door. She saw not just herself and her father, but echoes of every person who had been part of this journey. Survivors, advocates, allies. She saw the strength of a movement that had started with one voice and had grown into a global chorus of change. The gala continued late into the night, a celebration not just of the past 10 years, but of the promise of the future. As Emily made her final rounds, thanking guests and saying goodbyes, she felt a renewed sense of purpose and determination. The Nobel nomination, the international expansion, the technological innovations, they were all part of something bigger, a legacy of hope, of resilience, of the indomitable human spirit that could turn pain into purpose, tragedy into triumph. As the last guests departed and the team began the process of cleaning up, Emily found herself standing once again at the podium where she had delivered her speech earlier in the evening. The room was quiet now, the excitement of the gala replaced by a sense of peaceful anticipation. Emily ran her hand along the smooth wood of the podium, thinking of all the speeches she had given, all the stories she had shared, all the lives that had been changed because she had found the courage to speak out. "Ready to go, Em?" her father called from across the room. Emily smiled, taking one last look around the ballroom. "Yes," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "I'm ready." As they walked out into the cool night air, Emily Hartley felt the weight of the past 10 years, the triumphs and the setbacks, the joys and the sorrows. But more than that, she felt the promise of the future, a future they were building together, one life at a time, one story at a time. The work was far from over. There would be new challenges to face, new battles to fight. But Emily knew that whatever came their way, they would face it together, with compassion, with courage, and with an unwavering commitment to creating a world where everyone could live free from abuse and empowered to write their own stories of hope and transformation. As Emily got into the car beside her father, she took one last look at the building where they had celebrated a decade of change. The Hartley Foundation had started as one woman's journey of healing and had grown into a global force for good. And this, Emily knew, was just the beginning. The car pulled away from the curb, carrying Emily towards home and towards whatever new adventures tomorrow would bring. The city lights blurred past the window, each one a reminder of the lives they had touched and the lives yet to be changed. Emily Hartley smiled, ready to embrace whatever the future held. For in the end, it wasn't about the accolades or the recognition. It was about the legacy of hope they were creating, a legacy that would continue to grow and flourish long after this night was over. The journey continued, and Emily was ready for every step of it.